The New Mexico territory in the late 1870s was not a place that welcomed strangers. It was a vast, open furnace where the earth itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to die. To the west, the red rock mesas rose up like the spine of some great buried beast, jagged and unforgiving against a sky so blue it hurt the eyes to look at it too long. Dust was the only constant companion here. It found its way into the seams of clothing, into the creases of the skin, and between the teeth, gritty and tasting of ancient stone, when the wind blew, which it did with a relentless, howling persistence. It stripped the moisture from a man's lips and left the land scoured clean of mercy. A solitary stagecoach rattled and groaned along a rutted track that cut through this desolation. The leather thoroughbraces creaked under the strain, protesting every rock and dip in the road. Inside the cabin, the air was stifling, thick with the smell of sweat, stale tobacco, and the dry, pervasive dust. Hank Mallory sat with his back to the horses, his boots braced against the floorboards to steady himself against the lurching of the coach. He was a man of 50 years, with a face weathered like old saddle leather and eyes that were constantly calculating the value of everything they touched. He owned the Double Bar M Ranch, a sprawling claim that sat precariously on the edge of the borderlands, right where civilization tried to dig its fingernails into the dirt and hold on against the wild. Opposite him sat two figures who seemed to belong to the landscape outside rather than the confined space of the coach. To the left sat Nahastzan. She was small, her dark hair pulled back severely, her hands folded in her lap so tightly that the knuckles were white. She wore a calico dress that was too big for her, a garment given to her by a missionary's wife, and it hung on her frame like a shroud. Her eyes darted to the window every time the coach jolted, scanning the horizon as if she expected the earth to open up and swallow them whole. Beside her sat Goyal. He took up more than his share of the bench. He was a mountain of a man, broad in the shoulders and thick in the chest, with a stillness about him that was more unnerving than any threat. He wore a mixture of white man's clothes and Apache buckskin, a flannel shirt strained across his back, but moccasins on his feet that made no sound when he shifted. His face was a map of violence. A thick, pale scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, cutting through the sparse stubble on his cheek. His hair was black and coarse, hanging loose to his shoulders. He did not look at Hank. He did not look at his wife. He stared straight ahead at the wooden wall of the coach, his dark eyes unblinking, possessing the sharp, predatory focus of a hawk perched on a high branch. Through the window, the landscape offered grim reminders of why they were there. They passed the blackened skeleton of a homestead, the chimney standing alone like a tombstone among the charred timbers. A mile later, they passed 3 shallow graves near a dry creek bed, the wooden crosses lashed together with twine and tilting crookedly in the wind. Hank cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense silence. He pulled a silver flask from his coat, took a swig, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "We are clear on the arrangement, then," Hank said, his voice rough. He looked at Goyal, though the Apache man did not turn his head. "You work the cattle. You track strays, but mostly, you keep your eyes on the ridge. You smell your own kind coming before we do. That is what I am paying for. Shelter, food, and the law stays off your neck as long as you are on my land." Goyal finally shifted his gaze. When he looked at the rancher, the temperature in the coach seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I know the words," he said. His voice was deep, scraping like gravel. His English was slow, deliberate, each word chosen carefully. "I keep the raiders away. You keep the rope away. That is the size of it." Hank nodded, capping his flask. He gestured vaguely toward Nahazan. "And the woman helps in the kitchen or with the washing. My wife, Alice, will find use for her. It is a better life than starving in the agency camps. I will tell you that much. You are civilized now. That is what this is." Nahazan flinched at the word civilized. She looked at Goyale, her eyes wide and pleading, but he remained impassive. She shrank back against the cushions, terrified not just of the white man, but of the silence of her husband. She could feel the anger radiating off him. a tightly coiled spring of humiliation and rage that he was forced to suppress for the sake of their survival. They were trophies. She realized. Hank Mallory was bringing them home not just as workers, but as proof that he had tamed the wild, that he had a monster on a leash to guard his door. The coach crested a rise, and the double bar M spread out below them. It was a fortress of a ranch, the main house built of heavy timber and adobe, surrounded by a maze of corrals and bunkhouses. Smoke rose from the chimney, snatched away instantly by the prairie wind. Down in the yard, Maria was scrubbing laundry in a large galvanized tub. The water was cold, drawn from the deep well that morning, and the lye soap had turned her hands raw and red, cracking the skin across her knuckles. She was 22 years old, though her eyes held the weariness of a woman twice that age. Her hair was thick and dark, braided quickly and pinned up to keep it out of the suds. She was of mixed blood. Her father, a Mexican laborer she barely remembered. Her mother, a woman who had died coughing blood in a shack 2 winters ago. To the Mallorys, and to the world, Maria was nobody. She was the help. She was the invisible machinery that kept the ranch running. She paused in her scrubbing as the stagecoach thundered into the yard, the driver hauling back on the reins and shouting to the team. Dust billowed up, coating the fresh laundry she had just hung on the line. But she did not move to brush it off. She watched. The door of the coach swung open. Hank stepped out first, dusting off his coat with an air of self-importance. Then came the woman, stepping down timidly, clutching a small bundle to her chest. Then Goyal emerged. Maria stopped breathing for a second. She had seen Apaches before, usually in chains or dead, strapped across a saddle. She had never seen one like this. He stepped down from the coach not with the shuffle of a servant, but with the fluid, dangerous grace of a mountain lion. He stood to his full height, towering over Hank, and scanned the ranch yard. His eyes swept over the bunkhouse, the corral, the main house, and finally rested for a brief second on Maria. It was a look of assessment. He was checking for threats. He was looking for the exits. A group of ranch hands had gathered near the barn, leaning on pitchforks and fence posts. They were hard men, drifters and gun hands who sold their loyalty for $30 a month and bad whiskey. "Well, look at that," one of them drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "Boss brought home a pet." "That ain't a pet." "Jed," another laughed, a man with a broken nose. "That there's a scalp hunter. Look at the size of him. I bet he eats raw meat for breakfast." "So, $5 says the sheriff hangs him before the month is out," Jed said, loud enough for the newcomers to hear. "Or I shoot him for looking at me wrong." Goyala heard them. Maria saw his jaw tighten, a small rhythmic pulsing of the muscle. But he did not turn. He stood beside his wife, his body creating a wall between her and the leering men. Nahutzan was trembling visibly now. She looked at the ranch hands, at their guns, at their mocking grins, and she looked ready to bolt into the desert right then and there. She reached out and touched Goyal's sleeve, her fingers shaking. He looked down at her. He did not offer comfort. He did not soften. He simply stood there, a monolith of scarred flesh and repressed fury. To Maria, watching from the washtub, he looked incredibly lonely. "Maria!" The sharp voice of Alice Mallory cut through the air. Hank's wife stood on the porch, a woman whose face was pinched tight with perpetual disapproval. "Quit gawking and get back to work," Alice snapped. "And then come help this woman get settled in the shed behind the smokehouse. I will not have them in the main bunkhouse with the men." Maria wiped her hands on her apron and hurried forward, keeping her head down. As she passed Goyala, she felt the heat of him, the sheer physical presence of the man. He smelled of sagebrush, old leather, and the metallic tang of the stagecoach rails. The shed assigned to them was little more than a tack room with a dirt floor. It had a single small window and a door that didn't latch properly. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in violent shades of purple and bruised orange, Maria brought them a lantern and a basket of food, cornbread, beans, and a pitcher of water. She paused outside the door, hearing voices. "I cannot breathe here." Nahazan was whispering. Her voice was thin, edged with hysteria. "Did you see them? The way they look at us? They have hatred in their eyes. Husband, they want to kill us." "They will not kill us." Goyalo's voice was lower, a rumble in the small space. "Mallory needs me. He needs a dog to bark at the shadows," she cried out softly. "I feel their eyes on me like hands, invisible hands around my throat. Why did we come here? We should have gone to the mountains. We should have died fighting." "There is no fighting left," Goyal snapped. The harshness of his tone made Maria flinch outside the door. "We eat here. We sleep here. We survive. That is all there is." "I cannot," she wept. "I am afraid of them. And I am afraid of you. You have become like stone. You do not touch me like a husband. You touch me like you are guarding a prisoner." There was a silence then, heavy and suffocating. Maria peered through a crack in the warped wood of the door. She saw Nahazan sitting on the pile of blankets, her face buried in her hands. Goyala stood in the center of the room, his back to her. His shoulders were rigid, the muscles of his back bunched tight under his shirt. He looked like a man trying to hold up a collapsing roof. He wanted to comfort her. Maria could see it in the way his hand twitched at his side, half raised, but he did not know how. The war had taken the softness out of him. He had nothing left to give but protection, and his protection was a terrifying thing. Maria knocked softly and pushed the door open. The conversation died instantly. Goyala spun around, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt before he recognized her. "I brought food," Maria said quietly, keeping her eyes on the floor to show no challenge. She set the basket down on a crate. Nahazan wiped her eyes quickly, ashamed to be seen weeping by a stranger. Goyala stared at Maria, his eyes narrowing. He seemed surprised that she had come at all, that she wasn't afraid to walk into the den of the savage. "Thank you," he said. The words were stiff, unused to the shape of gratitude. Maria nodded and backed out, closing the door. As she walked back to the main house, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling a strange heaviness in her chest. She knew what it was to be trapped. She knew what it was to be looked at as if you were dirt. The tension on the ranch over the next 2 days was like a wire pulled until it hummed. The ranch hands found reasons to walk by the corral where Goyal was breaking horses. They wanted to see him fail. They wanted to see the horse throw him, but Goyal did not fail. He moved with the animals, whispering to them in a language the white men didn't understand, his hands firm but respectful. He rode with a natural ease that made the other men jealous. Nahazan fared worse. She was terrified of everything. The chickens, the loud clang of the dinner triangle, the way Alice Mallory barked orders at her in rapid-fire English she couldn't comprehend. She stayed close to the shed or the edge of the kitchen, trying to make herself invisible. It happened on the 3rd evening. The sun was setting, casting long, distorted shadows across the dust. Nahazan had gone to the water trough near the corral to fill a bucket. Jed, the ranch hand with the tobacco stain on his chin, had been drinking from a jug of corn whiskey since noon. He was leaning against the fence, watching her. "Hey there," Jed called out, slurring his words. "You're a quiet little thing, ain't you? Don't say much." Nahazan froze. She kept her eyes on the water, trying to fill the bucket quickly. Jed pushed off the fence and staggered toward her. "I'm talking to you. It's rude not to answer when a man speaks to you." "Is that what your buck taught you, to be rude?" He reached out and grabbed her arm. Nahazan screamed, a sharp, piercing sound of pure terror. She dropped the bucket, water splashing over her skirts and Jed's boots. She tried to pull away, but Jed laughed, tightening his grip. "Whoa now, just trying to be friendly." He never finished the sentence. Goyal appeared as if he had materialized from the dust itself. He had been across the yard, coiling a rope, but he covered the distance in seconds. There was no shout of warning, no hesitation. He slammed into Jed with the force of a battering ram. The impact lifted the white man off his feet and sent him crashing into the dirt. Before Jed could even draw a breath, Goyal was on top of him. He didn't punch him. He grabbed Jed by the throat with one massive hand and slammed his head back into the hard-packed earth. Thud. Jed's eyes rolled back. He gagged, clawing at the hand that was crushing his windpipe. Goyal's face was a mask of dark, righteous fury. His teeth were bared in a silent snarl. He raised his other fist, ready to cave the man's face in. "Goyal!" The shout came from Hank Mallory. He was running from the porch, a shotgun in his hand. "Get off him! Get off him now, or I will blow a hole in you!" 3 other ranch hands rushed in, grabbing Goyal by the shoulders and arms, hauling him backward. It took all of them to pull him off. Goyala shook them off with a violent shrug, breathing hard, his chest heaving. He stood over the gasping Jed, his eyes burning. Nahastzan was cowering against the water trough, sobbing hysterically. Hank marched up to Goyal, the shotgun leveled at the Apache's chest. "You listen to me," Hank hissed, his face red. "I don't care what he did. You do not put your hands on a white man, not on my ranch. Do you understand me?" Goyala stared at the shotgun, then at Hank. "He touched her," he said, the words grinding out. "And you nearly killed him," Hank shouted. "One more stunt like that, one more, and I will let the sheriff ride out here with a rope. I won't stop him. You are here to work, not to murder my hands. Get back to your shed. Both of you. Get out of my sight." The ranch hands helped Jed up. He was coughing, clutching his throat, glaring at Goyal with murderous hate. "You're dead. Indian," he wheezed. "You hear me? You're dead." Goyala did not answer. He turned to Nahazan, reaching for her arm to guide her away, but she recoiled from him. She flinched as if he were the one who had attacked her. She looked at his hands that had just tried to kill a man, and she saw only violence. She saw the war that never ended. She scrambled away from him and ran toward the shed, not waiting for him. Maria stood on the back porch, clutching a basket of laundry. She had seen it all. She watched Goyal standing alone in the yard, surrounded by enemies, rejected by his wife. He looked at his own hands for a moment, then curled them into fists and walked slowly after Nahastzan. That night, the wind howled around the shed like a choir of ghosts. Inside, the air was thick with fear. Nahazan sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest. "We have to leave," she whispered. "They will kill you, that man. He will come back with a gun in the night." "I will be ready," Goyala said. He was sharpening his knife by the light of the lantern, the rhythmic shh of the stone on steel filling the room. "I do not want you to kill any more," she cried. "Every time you fight, the hate grows. It is a fire. Husband, you are pouring oil on it. I cannot stay here. I cannot be the reason you die." "You are my wife," he said, not looking up. "I protect you. That is the way." "You cannot protect me from their hate," she said, her voice trembling. "Your protection just makes them hate us more. You are too much like the war. When I look at you, I see the blood. I see the burning." Goyala stopped sharpening the knife. The words hit him harder than any bullet. He looked at her, his scarred face illuminated by the flickering yellow light. He wanted to tell her that he fought because he loved her. He wanted to tell her that without the war, he was just a man with nothing left. But the words stuck in his throat. He was not a man of speeches. He was a man of action, and his actions terrified the only person he had left. "Sleep," he said finally, his voice hollow. "We will talk in the morning." He blew out the lantern. But there was no talk in the morning. Goyal woke before the sun, the habit of a lifetime of scouting. The shed was cold. He reached out for the warmth of his wife beside him, but his hand found only the rough wool of the blanket. He sat up. The space beside him was empty. He stood, panic rising in his chest for the first time in years. He pushed open the door. The yard was gray with the pre-dawn light. The wind had died down. He looked at the ground. In the dust, he saw the small prints of her moccasins. They led away from the shed, past the corral, and out toward the open gate. He followed them with his eyes. They went west, toward the horizon, toward the emptiness of the desert. He walked to the gate. He traced the footprints until they hit the rocky ground of the trail and vanished. She had taken nothing but her small bundle. She had gone on foot, alone, into a land that killed the unprepared, because she feared staying with him more than she feared the desert. He stood there for a long time. The sun began to crest the mountains, painting the world in blood-red light. His chest felt scooped out, a vast, echoing cavern. He did not cry. Apache warriors did not cry over lost wives. But a silence settled over him that was heavier than any stone. He turned back to the ranch, his face a mask of iron. By mid-morning, the ranch was buzzing with the news. "Ran off," Jed was telling anyone who would listen, his voice raspy from his bruised throat. "Scared her off. He did, probably beat her during the night. You saw him yesterday. A man like that, he ain't got no human feeling. Even his own squaw couldn't stomach him." Hank Mallory spat on the ground. "Well, if she's gone, she's gone. I ain't sending men to look for a runaway Indian. She'll be dead in 2 days out there anyway. As for him, keep an eye on him. If he snaps, put him down." Maria was in the kitchen, kneading dough for the biscuits. The other maids, 2 older white women, were whispering excitedly. "I heard he threatened to cut her throat if she looked at another man," one whispered. "No, I heard she left because he has demons in him." The other replied, "Look at his eyes. There is no soul there." Maria slammed the ball of dough onto the table. The loud thwack made the women jump. "He did not hurt her," Maria said, her voice shaking slightly but clear. The women stared at her. "What would you know about it, girl?" one sneered. "I saw them," Maria said, staring down at the flour on her hands. "He was trying to keep her safe. She left because she was afraid of us, of this place." "Don't be a fool. Maria," the woman scoffed. "He is a savage. It is in the blood. Now get those biscuits in the oven before Mrs. Mallory takes a switch to you." Maria went back to work, but anger burned in her stomach like a coal. She watched through the window as Goyal worked. He was repairing a fence post, driving the nails with savage, precise blows. The ranch hands walked wide circles around him, snickering, pointing, making gestures of crazy people. They were mocking his pain. They were turning his tragedy into a joke. He ignored them. He worked without stopping, without drinking water, without looking up. But Maria saw the tension in his back. She saw the way his jaw was clamped so tight it must have hurt. He was swallowing his rage, forcing it down into his gut to keep from killing them all. He was alone, truly, completely alone in a world of enemies. Evening came, and the dinner bell rang. The hands trooped into the mess hall, loud and boisterous. Goyal did not come. He stayed by the corral, sitting on a crate in the gathering dark, staring at the western horizon where his wife had vanished. "He ain't eating?" the cook asked, looking at the plate of beans and salt pork left on the counter. "Good. Saves food." Maria wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the plate. Then she looked at the dark shape of the man out in the yard. "I will take it to him," she said. "Don't you go near him. Maria," the cook warned. "He is liable to bite your hand off. He's a wounded animal right now." "He is a man," Maria said quietly. She picked up the plate and a piece of cornbread. She walked out into the cool night air. The stars were coming out, millions of them, sharp and cold. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. She was afraid. The stories, the violence she had seen yesterday. It all screamed at her to turn back. But she remembered the look in his eyes when he stepped off the stagecoach. She remembered the way he had stood between his wife and the jeering men. She knew what it felt like to be judged for the blood in your veins before you even spoke a word. She walked to the shed. He wasn't inside. He was sitting on the ground outside the door, his back against the wood, one leg drawn up. He was whittling a piece of wood, the knife moving in slow, rhythmic strokes. He stopped when he heard her approach. He looked up. The lamplight from the bunkhouse window cast long shadows across his face. The scar looked deeper in the dim light. His eyes were black pits, unreadable, guarding a grief so deep it terrified her. For a heartbeat, Maria felt the same panic Nahazan must have felt. the overwhelming instinct to run from this dangerous, silent force. He looked lethal. He looked like he could snap her neck with one hand and feel nothing, but she did not run. She took a breath, steadied her trembling hands, and stepped closer. She forced herself to meet his gaze. She looked past the scar, past the rumors, past the fear. She looked at him. He stared back, the knife still in his hand. He was waiting for her to flinch. He was waiting for her to spit on him or run away. She did neither. She held out the plate. "You need to eat," she said. Her voice was small in the vast night, but it did not waver. Goyal looked at the food, then back at her face. He saw the brown of her eyes, the red, raw skin of her hands, the fear she was fighting down. He saw that she was standing her ground. Slowly, very slowly, he reached out and took the plate. His fingers brushed hers, rough, calloused skin against rough, calloused skin. "Thank you," he said. Maria nodded once, then turned and walked back toward the house, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm in her ears, leaving him alone in the dark. But perhaps, for the first time that day, not entirely unseen. The silence that stretched between them in the dark ranch yard was thick enough to choke on. Maria stood there, her arm trembling under the weight of the ceramic plate, the heat of the beans seeping through the bottom to warm her cold fingers. Goyal stared at her, his hand frozen halfway to the food, his eyes black and unreadable in the shadow of the shed. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian, something ancient and immovable that had been dropped into this dusty, hostile world. Most people would have dropped the plate and run. Most people would have seen the violence in his shoulders, the tension that radiated off him like heat from a stove, and backed away. But Maria had nowhere to run to. She had been running her whole life, in one way or another, and she was tired. She took a small, ragged breath. "Do you want more bread?" she asked. The words hung in the air, fragile and absurdly domestic against the backdrop of his grief and the raw hostility of the ranch. Her voice shook, betraying her fear, but she did not lower her eyes. She watched his face, waiting for the explosion, waiting for the monster the ranch hand spoke of to emerge. Goyal blinked. The movement was slow, heavy. He seemed to be processing her words as if they were a code he had to decipher. He looked at the extra piece of cornbread balanced on the rim of the plate, then back at her face. He was accustomed to the barked orders of soldiers, the fearful whispers of settlers, or the hate-filled slurs of the ranch hands. He was not used to being asked a question that required nothing from him but an appetite. "The bread," he said finally. His voice was a low rumble, scraping against the silence. His English was broken, the vowels flattened and elongated, his accent thick with the cadences of the Athabascan tongue. "It is good." He took the plate. His fingers were large, stained with the dust of the corral and the grease of the tack he had been mending. They brushed against her small, red hands, and the contact sent a jolt through her that was not entirely fear. "I can bring more tomorrow," Maria said, her voice gaining a fraction of steadiness. "If you are hungry." Goyal nodded once, a sharp jerk of his chin. He watched her closely, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was listening not just to her words, but to the sound of them. She did not speak to him as if he were a dog to be kicked or a devil to be exorcised. She did not spit the word Apache, or the even worse names the men used when she looked at him. To her, he was simply a man who needed to eat. That small difference lodged in his mind like a burr under a saddle blanket. It was a singular point of softness in a world that had become entirely hard edges. Over the next few days, a quiet ritual formed between them. It was a fragile thing, built in the margins of the day when the sun had dipped below the mesas and the shadows grew long enough to hide them. Maria would finish her work in the main house, her back aching and her feet swollen, and she would slip out to the shed with a plate or a wrapped bundle of food. Sometimes she stayed only long enough to hand it to him. Other times, she lingered for a minute or two, pretending to adjust her shawl or check the latch on the gate. They said very little. The air between them was heavy with things unsaid, curiosity that was too dangerous to voice. and a strange, magnetic pull that neither of them had the words to name. It was the recognition of one survivor acknowledging another, but the daylight hours offered no such comfort. Maria's life was a grinding wheel that never stopped turning. She rose every morning while the sky was still the color of a bruise, shivering in the pre-dawn chill. Her first task was the well. The bucket was heavy, the rope rough against her palms, and the water was freezing. She hauled it up, bucket after bucket, until her arms burned and her breath smoked in the air. Then came the scrubbing, floors that were perpetually dusty, linen stained with sweat and grease, heavy cast-iron pots encrusted with burnt fat. Alice Mallory presided over this domain with a tyranny born of her own unhappiness. She was a woman who felt the isolation of the frontier like a personal insult, and she took it out on the only person beneath her in the hierarchy. "You missed a spot, girl," Alice snapped one morning, pointing a bony finger at a streak of dust on the sideboard. "My house is not a barn, even if you are used to living in one." Maria bit her tongue, wiping the spot again. "Yes, ma'am." "And tuck your hair in," Alice continued, her voice sharp and grating. "You look wild. Half wild. Anyway, you ought to be grateful. Maria, a girl like you, with your background, you would be in a brothel in Santa Fe if Mr. Mallory hadn't taken pity on you. Don't you forget that." The shame burned hot in Maria's cheeks, flushing her skin darker. It was a constant refrain that she was saved, that she was lucky, that her mixed blood destined her for sin, and that only the charity of the Mallorys kept her from the gutter. She kept her head down, scrubbing harder, transferring her anger into the wood of the floorboards until her knuckles turned white. Through the window, she could see the corral. Goyal was there, breaking a roan stallion that had already thrown 2 men. He moved with a terrifying patience. He did not yell at the horse. He did not whip it. He simply held the line, his body absorbing the animal's panic and fury, his presence a heavy, calming weight. The ranch hands sat on the fence, smoking and waiting for him to bleed. But he disappointed them every time. He was isolated in his competence, just as she was isolated in her servitude. A week after Nahazan fled, the weather turned. The sky, usually a piercing infinite blue, began to curdle. A sickly yellow haze rose in the west, blotting out the sun and turning the light eerie and dim. The wind picked up, not the usual gusty breeze, but a steady, moaning force that carried the taste of copper and dry earth. "Dust storm coming," Hank yelled from the porch. "Batten down! Get the stock in!" The ranch erupted into chaotic activity. Men shouted, horses whinnied in agitation, and doors slammed. Maria ran from room to room in the main house, latching shutters and stuffing rags into the cracks beneath the doors to keep the grit out. When the house was secured, she remembered the laundry on the line. She grabbed a basket and ran out the back door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, staggering her. The air was already thick with flying sand that stung her face and filled her eyes. She tore the sheets from the line, fighting the gale that tried to rip them from her hands. Through the swirling yellow haze, she saw a figure standing near the edge of the property, past the barn, where the wind had nothing to break its path. It was Goyala. He was not taking shelter. He was standing facing the wind, looking west, toward the distant purple shapes of the Dragoon Mountains that were rapidly disappearing behind the wall of dust. He stood with his feet apart, bracing himself against the onslaught, his hair whipping violently around his face. Maria clutched the basket to her chest and hesitated. The smart thing to do was to run back inside the sturdy house. But something about the way he stood there, so defiant and yet so utterly defeated, pulled at her. She dropped the basket on the porch and ran toward him, shielding her eyes with her arm. "Goyala!" she shouted, the wind tearing the name from her lips. He did not turn. She reached him, gasping for breath, the grit coating her tongue. She grabbed his sleeve. "You have to come inside. The storm, it is bad." He looked down at her then. His eyes were red-rimmed from the dust, but clear. "I know this wind," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried under the howl of the storm. "It comes from the lands where I was born." He didn't move. He seemed to be trying to see through the dust, to see something that was no longer there. Maria huddled next to him, turning her back to the wind. "Please," she said. "It cuts like glass." He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the way she shivered, the way she covered her mouth with her apron. He shifted his stance, moving his broad body so that he stood between her and the wind. The relief was instant. His bulk broke the force of the gale, creating a small pocket of relative calm around her. "Why do you stay out here?" she asked, shouting to be heard. "There is no room for me in there," he said, nodding toward the bunkhouse where the windows were dark. "And in the shed, the walls are too close. The silence is too loud." He looked back toward the mountains. "The soldiers came in a wind like this," he said suddenly. He wasn't speaking to her, not exactly. He was speaking to the storm. "They burned the village while the dust hid them. My mother, 2 brothers, my niece. She was 3 years old." Maria froze. He had never spoken of his past. No one on the ranch knew anything about him other than the rumors of his brutality. "They died?" she asked softly. He touched the scar on his jaw. "Fire," he said. "The white men think these marks are from war, from fighting. They are not. They are from trying to pull bodies out of a burning lodge." He dropped his hand. "They are reminders. That I was too slow, that I lived when they did not." The pain in his voice was so raw it made Maria's chest ache. It was not the angry, shouting pain of the men in the saloon. It was a deep, hollow agony that had hollowed him out from the inside. "I know," Maria said. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. "I know that feeling." Goyal looked down at her. "You? Bandits," she said, closing her eyes against the grit. "On the road to Tucson, my father, they shot him for his horse and $2 in his pocket. My mother and I ran. We lived in a shack made of tin. The winter took her. The fever burned her up. And I had no medicine. I had nothing." She looked up at him, her eyes watering from the wind and the memory. "I have no one left. Just a few coins under a mattress and a name that means nothing to anyone here. The land. It took everything from you. And it took everything from me." Goyal stared at her. For the first time, the distance between them, the chasm of race, of gender, of history, seemed to vanish. They were just 2 broken people standing in a storm that wanted to scour them from the earth. He raised a hand as if to touch her shoulder, to offer comfort, but he stopped inches from her fabric. He pulled his hand back, curling it into a fist at his side. He was careful, so careful, not to touch her. It was as if he believed her hands were only made for breaking things, and he was terrified of breaking her. "We should go back," he said gruffly. "The sand, it will skin you." He kept himself positioned between her and the wind as they walked back to the buildings. He walked with a protective stiffness, shielding her until they reached the back porch. As Maria stepped onto the wood, the kitchen door flew open. Alice Mallory stood there, her face twisted in fury. "Maria!" she screeched. "What in God's name are you doing?" Alice glared past Maria at the towering form of Goyale standing in the swirling dust. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion and disgust. "Get in here this instant!" Alice grabbed Maria by the arm and yanked her inside, slamming the door against the wind. The silence of the kitchen was sudden and ringing. "Have you lost your mind?" Alice hissed, shaking Maria. "Standing out there with him? In a storm? Do you want to be killed? Do you want to be ruined?" "I was just—" Maria started. "I saw you." Alice cut her off. "I saw you standing close to him. You were inviting trouble. Girl, you are tempting a savage. Do you think he sees you as a woman? He sees you as prey. If Mr. Mallory knew you were fraternizing with that animal, he would throw you out on the road before supper." Maria pulled her arm away, her face burning. Shame washed over her, the shame of being scolded like a child, the shame of the accusation. But beneath the shame, a hot, hard knot of anger tightened. "He is not an animal," Maria said, her voice trembling but audible. "He was protecting me from the wind." Alice stared at her, stunned by the defiance. Then she laughed, a harsh, dry sound. Protecting you. That man doesn't know the meaning of the word unless it involves a knife. You stay away from him. Maria, I warn you. You are close to the edge as it is." Alice stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Maria leaning against the counter, her heart pounding. She felt torn in two. Part of her was terrified. Terrified of losing the roof over her head. Terrified that Alice was right about the danger. But another part of her, the part that had stood in the storm and heard the grief in Goyal's voice, was furious at the injustice of it all. The storm passed, but the atmosphere in the town of Silver Creek, 10 miles down the road, grew darker. A week later, Maria drove the wagon into town for flour and coffee. The main street was muddy from a brief rain, and the mood was sullen. Men stood on the boardwalks, watching her pass, their eyes hard. Inside the general store, the proprietor, Mr. Henderson, weighed her order with unnecessary slowness. 2 women were whispering near the bolt of calico fabric. "They say she never made it to the reservation." One whispered loud enough for Maria to hear. "They say he followed her out into the desert that night." "Who?" the other asked. "The Apache, that big one Mallory keeps. They say he caught her and, well, they say he buried her in a dry wash to hide the body. A man like that, once he gets a taste for blood, he don't stop with enemies. He'll kill his own." Maria's hand tightened on the counter. "That is a lie," she said. The women stopped whispering and looked at her. Mr. Henderson paused, a sack of flour in his hand. "Excuse me?" the woman said, arching an eyebrow. "He did not leave the ranch that night," Maria said, her voice tight. "He was there in the morning. He did not kill her. She ran away because she was afraid of you, of all of you." Mr. Henderson slammed the flour down. "That's enough of that. Maria, you don't speak to customers that way, and you don't go defending a redskin murderer in my store. Everyone knows what happened. It's just a matter of time before the sheriff finds the bones." Maria took her supplies and left, her cheeks burning. The lie was spreading like a sickness. It was easier for them to believe Goyal was a monster who killed his wife than to admit that their own hatred had driven a terrified woman into the wasteland. When she returned to the ranch, she saw Goyal chopping wood near the shed. He was working with a rhythmic, punishing intensity. The axe rose and fell, splitting the logs with a single clean strike every time. He didn't look up as she drove the wagon past, but she saw the set of his shoulders. He carried the weight of the accusations like another stone on his back. He knew what they were saying. He could feel it in the way the ranch hand spat when he walked by. 2 evenings later, the sun was setting in a blaze of crimson. Maria was crossing the yard to the well when she saw Goyale near the breaking pen. He was holding his left hand, pressing it against his side. Blood was dripping between his fingers, dark and heavy, pooling in the dust by his moccasins. She dropped her bucket and ran to him. "You are hurt!" Goyala turned away, shielding his hand. "It is nothing," he grunted. "A rope burn. The horse pulled." "Let me see," Maria insisted. She reached for his hand. He tried to pull away. "No, go back to the house. The mistress will see." "I do not care if she sees," Maria said, a sudden fierceness in her voice. She grabbed his wrist. It was thick and hard as oak, but he let her pull his hand forward. It was more than a burn. The rope had flayed the skin across his palm and cut deep into the meat of his thumb. It was jagged and ugly, packed with dirt from the corral. "This needs to be cleaned," she said firmly, "or it will rot. Come." She led him not to the house, but to the water trough. She tore a strip from her apron, dipping it into the cool water. Goyal stood still, watching her. He was breathing shallowly, his chest rising and falling in short, controlled hitches. Maria took his hand in hers. Her fingers were small and brown against his scarred, copper skin. She began to wipe the dirt away, her touch gentle but firm. The water turned pink as it dripped back into the trough. "This will sting," she whispered. "I have felt worse," he said. She looked up, and he was watching her. He wasn't watching her hands. He was watching her face. His eyes were dark pools, bottomless and intense. For the first time, she saw something other than grief in them. She saw a hunger, not for food and not for violence. It was a hunger for the softness of her touch, for the kindness she was offering without price. The scene became intensely intimate. The rest of the ranch faded away. The lowing of the cattle, the distant laughter of the bunkhouse. There was only the sound of the water dripping and the proximity of their bodies. Maria dried the wound with the dry end of the cloth and began to bind it. She had to step closer to wrap the fabric tightly. She could smell him, sweat, sage, and the iron scent of blood. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest. She tied the knot and looked up. They were inches apart. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew she should step back. She knew that if anyone saw them, if Hank or Alice walked out, it would be the end of her life here. But she couldn't move. Goyal's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. The air between them crackled with forbidden tenderness. He looked as if he was fighting a war inside himself. The urge to reach out, to touch her face, to pull her into the solace of his arms, warring against the knowledge of what would happen to her if he did. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped. His hand, the uninjured one, twitched at his side, rising an inch before he forced it down. "Maria," he breathed. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded like a prayer and a warning all at once. The sound of it broke the spell. Goyal stepped back abruptly, putting 3 feet of distance between them. He turned his face away, staring into the darkness of the barn, hiding the raw want that had surfaced. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice rougher than usual. "For the hand." Maria stood there, her hands empty, trembling. She felt as though she had just stepped off a cliff and been caught at the last second. "You keep it clean," she stammered. She turned and walked quickly back to the kitchen, not looking back. She felt shaken, her skin prickling where the heat of him had been. She had crossed a line. She knew it. They both knew it. That night, in her small room off the kitchen, a closet, really, with a cot and a cracked mirror, Maria sat and stared at her reflection. She saw the fatigue under her eyes. She saw the simple dress of a servant, but she saw something else, too. Her eyes were bright. Her cheeks were flushed. For years, she had been nobody. She had been the girl who cleaned the floors, the girl with the mixed blood, the girl who was invisible. But tonight, she felt seen, truly seen, and the realization was terrifying. To be seen by a man like Goyal was to be drawn into the storm that surrounded him. In the shed, Goyala sat in the dark. He did not light the lantern. He held his bandaged hand, feeling the throb of the pulse in the wound. The memory of Nahazan's terror gnawed at him. I drove her away. He thought my darkness was too much for her. And now, here was Maria. She was smaller, softer, yet she had a spine of steel. She walked into the storm. She cleaned his blood. When she looked at him, the darkness inside him seemed to recede a little, pushed back by the light of her defiance. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the rough wood wall. He was cursed. He had to be. To desire this woman, to want her near him, was to doom her. If the town didn't kill him, they would destroy her just for standing next to him. But the memory of her hands on his skin burned brighter than the pain in his palm. It was a small, dangerous light in his mind, and he couldn't bring himself to snuff it out. The weeks that followed brought no relief. The land continued to tighten its grip. The rain that had muddied the streets of Silver Creek did not reach the ranch. The grass turned brittle and brown. One of the prize heifers collapsed near the creek bed, her tongue swollen from thirst, and died before Hank could get water to her. Sickness struck the neighboring homestead, the Miller place. Their youngest child came down with a fever that wouldn't break. In the superstitious logic of the frontier, misfortunes rarely came alone, and they always needed a cause. "It's the Apache," the ranch hands muttered over their coffee. "He's bad luck, bringing a curse on the land. Since he came, the rain stopped." Talk of raids began to drift in from the north. A stagecoach had been attacked near the border. 2 horses stolen. The descriptions were vague, But the anger was precise. Every time news of a raid reached the ranch, the men looked at Goyal with renewed hostility. They watched him as if waiting for a signal, as if he were sending smoke signals to his brethren in the night. Hank Mallory grew shorter-tempered. He rode Goyal hard, sending him out to track strays in the worst heat of the day, hoping, perhaps, that the man would break or leave so the problem would solve itself. But Goyal did not leave, and Maria did not step back. As the tension rose, she became his anchor. She brought him extra bread, hiding it under her apron. When she passed him in the yard, she didn't just nod. She paused. "How do you say water in your tongue?" she asked him one evening by the trough. He looked at her, surprised. "Two," he said. "Two," she repeated. "And wind. Niall." "Niall," she whispered, testing the sound. Each word was a small stone laid in a bridge across a chasm. The white men wanted to erase his language, to silence his world, by asking to learn it. Maria was telling him that his world mattered. She was telling him that he mattered. It was a dangerous game. The air around the ranch was electric with potential violence. Every glance they exchanged was a risk. But as the world around them grew harder and uglier, the fragile bond between the maid and the scout became the only thing that felt real. They were two wounded things, circling each other in the dark, waiting for the inevitable lightning strike to reveal them to the world. Spring arrived in the New Mexico territory, not with a burst of flowers, but with a sullen, grinding thaw. The snow that had capped the Dragoon Mountains melted in a rush, sending brown, churning water down the arroyos and turning the hard-packed dust of the roads into sucking clay. It was a season of mud. It coated the hem of Maria's skirts with a permanent heavy rim, caked the bellies of the horses, and ice seemed to drag down the spirits of every living thing on the Double Bar M Ranch. With the mud came a rising fever in the blood of the territory. The winter had been hard. Supplies were low, and patience was thinner than a worn saddle blanket. It started with rumors. A rancher 10 miles to the east, a man named Sullivan, claimed he had lost 4 horses in the night. He did not blame rustlers or wolves. He blamed the savages. It did not matter that the Apache bands were largely confined to the reservations or starving in the high peaks. The fear of them was a habit the white settlers could not break. It was easier to blame a ghost in the dark than to admit a fence was weak or a hand was careless. The talk crackled through the saloon in Silver Creek and whispered across the steps of the white church on Sundays. It was a dry tinder waiting for a spark, and Goyal, working silently on the Mallory Ranch, was the lightning rod standing in the middle of the field. Sheriff Barlow rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a flat, slate gray, threatening rain that refused to fall. Barlow was a man who wore his badge like a piece of jewelry he expected everyone to admire. He was heavy-set, with a mustache that hid a mouth prone to cruelty, and eyes that were constantly searching for something to punish. He sat on his horse near the main gate, not bothering to dismount. Hank Mallory walked out to meet him, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Sheriff," Hank said, nodding. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Barlow leaned forward, resting his forearms on the pommel of his saddle. His eyes drifted past Hank to the corral, where Goyal was mending a broken rail. The Apache stripped to his shirt sleeves despite the chill. His muscles corded as he hefted the heavy timber. "Just making rounds, Hank," Barlow said. "Hearing things, people are uneasy. Sullivan lost stock. There is talk of a raiding party moving south. I haven't seen any sign," Hank said, spitting into the mud. "Maybe not," Barlow said. He watched Goyal with a look of cold calculation, like a butcher eyeing a steer. "But then, you have got a fox guarding your henhouse, don't you? Having one of them on the property, it makes folks nervous. Hank, it looks like you are inviting trouble." Hank shifted his weight. He was a man squeezed between two pressures. On one side, his neighbors and the social order demanded he cast the Apache out. On the other, Goyal was the best worker he had ever had. The man worked for scraps, never complained, and could track a stray steer across solid rock. "He earns his keep," Hank said defensively. "He keeps the drifters away. And if there are raiders, He will smell them before we see them." Barlow chuckled, a dry sound without humor. "Does he? Or does he just open the gate when his cousins come calling? You walk a fine line. Hank, you keep a wolf on a chain. Sooner or later it remembers it is a wolf. If anything happens, anything at all, the town is going to look here first." Barlow straightened up and gathered his reins. "I would keep him on a short leash if I were you, real short. If he steps out of line, don't bother bringing him to jail. Just find a tall tree." Hank watched the sheriff ride away, his face darkening. He turned and looked at Goyal. The Apache had stopped working. He was standing perfectly still, watching the sheriff's retreating figure. He had heard every word. The distance was 50 yards, but Maria, watching from the kitchen window, knew that Goyal's hearing was as sharp as his knife. Hank walked over to the corral. "You heard him!" Hank barked, his voice loud enough for the hands in the bunkhouse to hear. "You watch yourself. I am sticking my neck out keeping you here. Don't make me regret it." Goyal did not answer. He drove a nail into the wood with a single, violent blow of his hammer. That evening, the tension in the house was palpable. Hank was drinking whiskey in the parlor, complaining to Alice about the price of feed and the ingratitude of the town. "They should be thanking me," he muttered, his speech slurring slightly. "I am taming him. I am making him useful. But no, they look at me like I am a traitor." In the kitchen, Maria was washing the last of the dinner plates. Her back ached, and her hands were swollen from the water. She moved mechanically, her mind on the man in the shed. She had not been able to take him food yet. The house had been too busy. The back door opened, letting in a gust of cold, damp air. It wasn't Goyal. It was Tom, Hank's 20-year-old son. Tom Mallory was a soft young man trying very hard to be hard. He had his father's entitlement, but none of his work ethic. He spent his days riding into town to gamble away his wages and his nights drinking in the barn to avoid his mother's scolding. He had the kind of face that was handsome until you looked closely and saw the weakness in the chin and the cruelty in the eyes. He stood in the doorway, swaying slightly, a bottle of rye dangling from his hand. "Well now," Tom said, grinning crookedly. "If it isn't the little saint, scrubbing away." Maria stiffened. "Good evening, Mr. Tom," she said, keeping her eyes on the suds. "I am almost finished." "No rush," Tom said, stepping inside and closing the door. He leaned against the counter, too close. The smell of cheap liquor and stale sweat rolled off him. "You are always working. Maria, always rushing off. Probably rushing off to feed your pet savage. Right?" Maria's heart skipped a beat. She did not know he had noticed. "I do my work, sir. That is all." "Don't lie to me," Tom sneered, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I have seen you sneaking out there, making eyes at him. It is disgusting. Really, a pretty thing like you, wasting your time on a redskin." He reached out and trailed a finger down her arm. Maria recoiled, shrinking back against the sink. "Please," she said, her voice tight. "I need to finish." "You need to learn your place," Tom snapped. His mood shifted instantly from mocking to aggressive. "You think you are better than me. You think because my father took you in off the street, you can look down your nose at me." "I do not think that," Maria said, panic rising in her throat. She wiped her hands on her apron and tried to sidestep him. "I must go to the barn to fetch more wood for the morning stove." It was a lie. The wood box was half full, but she needed to get out of the small kitchen. "I will help you," Tom said with a dark smile. He followed her out into the night. The air was cold and heavy with moisture. Maria walked fast, her boots slipping in the mud, heading for the barn. She hoped the presence of the horses, or perhaps one of the hands sleeping in the loft, would deter him. The barn was dark, smelling of sweet hay and manure. The only light came from the open door, a pale rectangle of gray moonlight. Maria went to the wood pile, her hands shaking as she grabbed a few logs. "Leave it," Tom said. He was standing in the doorway, blocking her exit. Maria dropped the wood. The logs clattered loudly on the dirt floor. "Mr. Tom," Please let me pass. Your mother will be wondering where I am." "Mother is sewing," Tom said, taking a step toward her. "And father is passed out in his chair. No one is wondering anything." He closed the distance between them. Maria backed up until her shoulders hit the rough wood of a stall. A horse snorted nearby, shifting its weight nervously. "You know," Tom murmured, breathing the whiskey fumes into her face, "I have been watching you. Maria, the way you walk, the way you look. You are too proud for a maid, and way too proud for a girl with your blood." He grabbed her wrist. His grip was wet and hot. "Let go!" Maria cried out. She tried to twist away, but he was stronger than he looked. "Stop fighting," Tom hissed. "You should be grateful a white man wants to pay you any attention at all. Who else would have you? That Apache?" He slammed her back against the stall door. The wood groaned. Pain shot through her shoulder. He pinned her there with his body, his free hand fumbling at her waist. Panic, cold and absolute, flooded Maria's chest. Memories she had buried deep. Memories of the road after her father died. Of men who looked at her like she was fruit to be bruised and discarded, flashed through her mind. "No!" she screamed. The sound was ragged, desperate. The wind outside howled, swallowing her voice. Tom laughed, a low, ugly sound in his throat. "Scream all you want. The hands are in the bunkhouse playing cards. No one hears a Mexican maid crying in the barn." He buried his face in her neck, his stubble scraping her skin. Maria struggled, kicking at his shins, clawing at his coat. But he was heavy, a suffocating weight. Tears of terror and rage pricked her eyes. "This is how it happens," she thought. "This is how I disappear." Then, the light from the doorway was blocked. There was no sound of footsteps, no shout. Just a sudden displacement of air, like a vacuum being filled by a storm. Tom was ripped away from her. It happened so fast Maria couldn't process it. One second Tom was pressing his weight against her. The next, he was flying backward through the air. He crashed into the opposite wall of the barn, hitting the wood with a bone-jarring thud. Goyal stood in the center of the aisle. He was not the stoic, silent worker now. He was a force of nature. His chest was heaving, his hands curled into claws. In the dim light, his eyes blazed with a fury that was terrifying to behold. It was a rage edged with terror, the terror of a man who had heard a woman scream and remembered every woman he had failed to save. Tom scrambled up, gasping for air. "You crazy!" He reached for the pistol at his belt. Goyal did not give him the chance. He closed the distance in 2 strides. He knocked Tom's hand away and slammed him back against the wall again. Goyal's forearm smashed into Tom's throat, pinning him there, lifting him onto his toes. Tom gagged, his face turning purple. He clawed at Goyal's arm, but it was like clawing at an iron bar. Goyal leaned in close. He snarled something in Apache, a guttural sound that vibrated with lethal intent. He raised his other fist, drawing it back. He was going to kill him. Maria saw it. He was going to crush Tom's skull right there in the barn. The years of insults, the years of watching men like Tom take and take and take, it was all focused in that one raised fist. "Goyala!" Maria screamed. "No!" The sound of her voice seemed to pierce the red haze of his rage. His fist hovered in the air. "Don't!" Maria begged, stepping forward, her hands outstretched. She was shaking so hard she could barely stand. "Stop, please! If you kill him, they will kill you. Please!" Goyala looked at her. He saw the tears on her face, the ripped collar of her dress. He looked back at Tom, whose eyes were bulging with fear. The choice hung in the air for a terrible, stretched second. The satisfaction of justice versus the necessity of survival. Slowly, with an agonizing effort of will, Goyal lowered his fist. He did not let go of Tom's throat immediately. He leaned in, his face inches from the young man's terror-stricken eyes. "You touch her again," Goyal said, his English thick and broken. "And I will not stop." He released the pressure. Tom slid down the wall, coughing and retching, clutching his throat. He looked up at the Apache, and for the first time in his life, he saw death looking back at him. Goyal stepped back, breathing hard. He looked at Maria. checking her for injuries with a quick, intense sweep of his eyes. "You are safe?" he asked. Maria nodded, unable to speak. Tom scrambled to his feet. He backed away toward the door, wheezing. As soon as he was clear of Goyala's reach, his fear turned to a vicious, poisoned bravado. "You are dead," Tom rasped, pointing a shaking finger. "You hear me? You attacked me, unprovoked. I will tell my father. I will tell the sheriff." He turned and ran out of the barn, shouting for help as he went. Silence rushed back into the barn, heavy and cold. "You should have let me finish it," Goyal said quietly. He was not looking at her. He was looking at his hands, which were still trembling with adrenaline. "Then you would be hanging by morning," Maria whispered. She walked over to him. She wanted to touch him, to thank him, but the air was too charged. Go to the shed, please." "It does not matter where I go," he said. "The story is already written." He turned and walked out into the night, moving with the heavy gait of a man walking toward a firing squad. By the time Maria reached the main house, the kitchen was a scene of chaos. Hank was shouting. Alice was weeping, clutching Tom, who was sitting at the table nursing a glass of whiskey and pointing at the red welts on his neck. "He tried to kill me," Tom was shouting. "I was just checking the horses, and he jumped me from the dark, like an animal. He had crazy in his eyes. Pa, if I hadn't fought him off." Hank turned as Maria entered. His face was purple with rage. "You!" Hank roared. "Tom says you were there. You saw it." Maria froze by the door. Every eye in the room turned to her. Tom looked at her over the rim of his glass, his eyes daring her to speak. "Tell them," his look said. "Tell them I tried to force you, and see who they believe. See what happens to a maid who calls the boss's son a rapist." "Well," Hank demanded, slamming his hand on the table, "did the Apache attack my son?" Maria's mouth felt like it was filled with dust. She looked at Hank, a powerful man who could cast her out into the starving winter. She looked at Alice, who would never believe her precious son was a monster. She looked at Tom, grinning his malicious, triumphant grin. And she thought of Goyal. If she told the truth, they would call her a liar and a whore. Tom would say she seduced him. They would fire her. And they would still hang Goyal because a white man's word was law. But if she lied, if she played the part of the stupid, frightened maid, maybe, just maybe, it would be seen as a fight, not an attempted murder. Maybe Hank's greed would outweigh his anger. Maria faltered. She looked down at her boots. "I was in the barn. It was dark. I heard a noise. When I looked, they were fighting." "Did Goyal start it?" Hank pressed. "Did you see him jump Tom?" I didn't see the start, sir," Maria whispered. "I only saw them when they were already struggling." "And he had his hands on his throat?" "Yes, sir," Hank swore loudly. "That is it, then. An unprovoked attack. That savage is done." "I gave him a chance. I gave him a roof. And this is how he repays me." Hank stormed toward the door. "I am going to the bunkhouse. We will lock him in the tack room tonight. And tomorrow I decide what to do with him." Tom smirked. He had won. Maria stood in the kitchen as the room emptied. She felt sick. She felt a shame so deep it burned her insides like acid. She had saved herself, but she had sold the only person who had ever stood up for her. Outside, in the dark, Goyal stood near the window. He had heard her faltering voice, her refusal to accuse Tom. For a moment, a bitter taste filled his mouth. Betrayal. It was a flavor he knew well, but then he remembered the terror in her eyes when Tom had her pinned. He remembered the shaking of her hands. He understood the trap. She was a small bird caught between hawks. To speak the truth was to die. He did not blame her. He blamed the world that made a lie the only shield she had. His anger, which had flared hot enough to kill, cooled into a hard, dense stone in his chest. He turned and walked to the tack room, waiting for the men to come with their ropes and their guns. The next day passed in a suffocating haze. Hank did not hang Goyal, mostly because he needed the scout for the upcoming cattle drive, and he knew losing him would cost money. But he had him chained in the barn, treated like a rabid dog that needed to be broken. Goyale was put to work mucking out stalls with a guard watching him. He was forbidden to speak. He was forbidden to eat with the others. Maria worked in a daze of misery. She could not meet anyone's eyes. Every time she saw Tom, he winked at her, a silent reminder of her complicity. That evening, the moon rose full and bright, illuminating the muddy ranch yard in silver light. Maria finished her work and slipped out. She knew it was dangerous, but she could not sleep with the weight on her soul. She found Goyal near the back of the corral. He was not chained now. Hank had relented that much after the work was done, but he was confined to the yard. He was leaning against the fence, staring out at the horizon where the moonlight turned the desert into a sea of ghosts. Maria approached him slowly. "Goyale," she whispered. He did not turn. His profile was sharp against the sky. "I am sorry," she said, her voice breaking. Tears hot and fast spilled down her cheeks. "I am so sorry. I should have told them. I was a coward. I was afraid they would throw me out. I was afraid they wouldn't believe me." She took a step closer, wringing her hands. "If I had told the truth, maybe—" "If you had told the truth," Goyala said, his voice low and steady, "you would be on the road with nothing, and I would be swinging from a cottonwood tree." He turned to face her. His face was not angry. It was tired, infinitely tired, but his eyes were clear. "You did what you had to do to survive," he said. "I know this. The rabbit does not apologize to the wolf for running into a hole. You are in the hole. Stay there. Stay safe." "But it is not right," Maria cried softly. "You saved me, and I let them blame you." "Right does not matter here," Goyale said. "Only living matters. You live. I live. That is the victory." Maria looked at him, stunned by his grace. He had every right to hate her, to despise her weakness. Instead, he offered her absolution. "You forgive me?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "There is nothing to forgive," he said. In that moment, the shame that had been crushing her chest cracked open, and something else flooded in. It was a feeling of profound connection, a bond forged in the fires of their shared trauma. They were both outcasts, both forced to navigate a world that wanted to crush them. She reached out and touched his arm. This time, he did not pull away. Her fingers brushed the rough fabric of his sleeve, feeling the solid warmth of the muscle beneath. "Thank you," she whispered. "Do not thank me," he said. "Just stay away from him. From the sun." "I will," she vowed. They stood there in the moonlight, the silence between them no longer heavy, but charged. They were standing too close. The heat of their bodies radiated across the narrow gap. The smell of the mud, the sage, and the horses faded away, leaving only the scent of him. Maria looked up at his face. She saw the scar that ran along his jaw, the map of his history. She felt a sudden, fierce desire to trace it with her finger, to soothe the old hurts. Goyal looked down at her. He saw the way the moonlight caught in her dark hair, the vulnerability in her parted lips. He felt a pull so strong it almost frightened him. He wanted to reach out. He wanted to cup her face in his hands and tell her that she was the only beautiful thing in this ugly world. He lifted his hand. His calloused fingers hovered near her temple, trembling slightly. He wanted to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. It was a simple gesture, but for him, it was a confession. "I want you. I want to hold you, but I am death to you." His fingers hovered a breath from her skin. The restraint was palpable. It vibrated in the air. Maria stopped breathing. She felt his hand there, felt the ghost of his touch. Something inside her gave way, a wall she had built to keep out hope. She realized, with a jolt that went straight to her core, that she didn't just want his protection. She wanted him. She wanted to be chosen by this man who had been stripped of everything and yet remained unbroken. She wanted to be cherished. "Goyal," she breathed. He dropped his hand. He clenched it into a fist at his side, fighting the urge to pull her against him. "Go inside, Maria," he rasped. "Please." It was a plea for mercy, mercy from his own desire. Before she could move, the sound of galloping hooves shattered the moment. They both spun around. A rider was coming hard up the road, mud flying from the horse's hooves. He galloped through the gate and pulled up in front of the main house, shouting, "Hank! Hank Mallory!" The front door opened. Hank stepped out, rifle in hand. "What is it?" Hank yelled. "News from the north," the rider shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "The raiding party. They hit the Johnson place last night, burned the barn, killed 2 cows. They say it was Apaches." Hank cursed. "Are they coming this way?" "Don't know," the rider said. "But the town is in an uproar. Barlow is organizing a posse. They are saying they are done waiting for the army. They are saying it is time to clean house." The rider's eyes fell on Goyale, standing in the shadows of the corral. He pointed. "And Barlow says," the rider shouted, "that maybe we ought to start with the one we already have handy. Send a message to the others. Show them what happens when they cross the line." Hank looked at the rider, then at Goyale. He didn't defend his scout. He didn't speak up. He just stood there, calculating the odds. "Tell Barlow I will talk to him in the morning," Hank said. The rider wheeled his horse and galloped off. Maria felt the blood drain from her face. The air had shifted. It was no longer just prejudice and insults. It was a death sentence. She looked at Goyal. He was standing perfectly still, watching the darkness where the rider had gone. He looked like a man who heard the executioner's footsteps and was not surprised. Maria realized then that her feelings were no longer a secret luxury she could keep hidden in her heart. They were a liability. And they were a motivation. She loved him. The thought was terrifying, but it was true. And because she loved him, she could not let him stand there and wait for the rope. She reached out and grabbed his hand, squeezing it hard. "They are coming for you," she whispered fiercely. "I know," he said. "We have to do something," she said. "You have to do nothing," he said, pulling his hand away gently. "You have to survive." But Maria looked at him, and her jaw set in a line of stubborn determination that matched his own. "No," she thought, "not this time. This time, the rabbit fights." The days that followed were suffocating, as if the entire territory were holding its breath waiting for a gunshot. The heat lay heavy and stagnant over the double bar M, pressing down on the roof of the ranch house and shimmering in waves off the hard-packed earth of the corral. In the afternoons, dry lightning storms began to stalk the plains. Huge, anvil-shaped clouds would build in the west, turning the color of a fresh bruise, but they brought no rain. Instead, jagged veins of white fire would arc across the sky, striking the ground with a sound like a cracking whip. Maria stood on the back porch one evening, wiping sweat from her neck, and watched a bolt strike a lone cottonwood near the creek bed. The tree burst into flame instantly, a torch against the darkening sky. For a moment, it burned with a terrifying, beautiful intensity, illuminating the sagebrush around it. Then the wind shifted, choking the fire out as quickly as it had begun, leaving only a blackened skeleton smoking in the twilight. It felt like a warning. Lives here were like that tree, standing tall one moment, consumed by sudden violence the next, and then extinguished, leaving nothing but a scar on the land. The inevitable arrived 2 days later in the form of Sheriff Barlow and a posse of 4 deputies. They did not ride with the casual arrogance of a social visit. They rode hard, their horses kicking up dust, their rifles resting conspicuously across their saddles. Hank Mallory walked out to meet them, his face set in a hard line. Goyala was in the breaking pen, working a young mare. He stopped when the riders entered the yard, his hand resting gently on the horse's neck. He did not run. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply stood there, watching the lawman with the stillness of a man who has seen this moment coming for a lifetime. "Sheriff," Hank said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "You are back sooner than I expected." "We got a report." "Hank," Barlow said, swinging down from his saddle. The leather of his holster creaked. "Anonymous, but reliable enough. Someone saw an Apache matching your boy's description near the Johnson place the night of the raid. Said he was scouting the perimeter." "That is a lie," Hank said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was here, locked in the tack room. Can anyone vouch for that? Barlow asked, looking past Hank to the pen. Did you sit up all night and watch the door, Hank, or did you sleep? Hank hesitated. That hesitation was all the permission Barlow needed. He jerked his head at his deputies. Bring him in. Two of the men unlatched the gate and approached Goyal. They moved cautiously, guns drawn, as if approaching a mountain lion. Goyale held his hands out, wrists together. He offered no resistance, which seemed to disappoint the men. They holstered their guns and pulled rough hemp rope from their belts, binding his wrists tight enough to cut off the blood. Maria was watching from the kitchen window. The sight of the rope biting into his dark skin made something inside her snap. The caution she had lived with for years, the survival instinct that told her to be invisible, shattered. She burst out the back door and ran across the yard. "No!" she shouted. "Stop! You are making a mistake!" Barlow turned, his eyebrows raised in mock surprise. Well now, the maid has an opinion. Maria skidded to a halt between Hank and the sheriff. Her chest was heaving, her hands balled into fists at her sides. "He was here," she insisted, her voice shaking with the force of her fear. "He was here that night. I saw him in the yard." "You saw him, did you?" Barlow stepped closer, looming over her. He smelled of stale sweat and chewing tobacco. "And what were you doing watching him in the middle of the night, girl? Waiting for a rendezvous?" "I was working," Maria lied desperately. "I saw him. He never left the ranch. He is not a raider. He saved me from—" She cut herself off, glancing at Tom, who was watching from the porch with a smirk. "He protects this ranch. He is not a monster." Barlow laughed, a harsh, barking sound. He looked at his deputies. "You hear that, boys? The little Mexican girl is sweet on the savage. I guess it is true what they say. Some women like a bit of wild in their bed." The crude words hit Maria like a slap. She flinched, her face burning with humiliation. But she did not back down. "He is innocent," she said again, though her voice was smaller now. "He is an Apache," Barlow said, his voice dropping the mockery and becoming cold as iron. "That is all the guilt he needs in this county. Get out of the way, girl, before I arrest you for obstructing justice." Maria looked to Hank, pleading with her eyes. "Mr. Mallory, please, you know he works hard. You know he didn't do this." Hank would not look at her. He stared at the ground, kicking at a clod of dirt. "Go back inside. Maria," he muttered. "Hold your tongue if you want to keep your job. I will not have you making a scene in front of the law." "But, sir—" "Inside!" Hank roared. "Now!" Maria stood frozen, tears blurring her vision. She looked at Goyal. He was watching her, his face impassive, but his eyes were soft. He gave a nearly imperceptible shake of his head. "Do not fight," he was telling her. "You cannot win this." The deputies shoved Goyal toward a horse, hoisted him up, and tied his feet beneath the belly. They rode out in a cloud of dust, taking him toward a trial that would be nothing more than a formality before the hanging. Maria stood in the yard until the dust settled. The silence that followed was heavy with cowardice. Hank went back into the house to pour a drink. Tom stayed on the porch, lighting a cigar, looking satisfied. Maria felt a cold resolve harden in her stomach. She could not save him here. Her word meant nothing against the prejudice of the town. She needed truth. She needed something real that could cut through the lies. She ran to the shed, grabbed a canteen and a shawl, and started walking west. The journey to the Apache camp was a descent into hell. It was miles of broken country, a landscape of sharp volcanic rock and thorny mesquite that seemed designed to tear at human flesh. Maria walked until her shoes were shredded. The sun beat down on her, a physical weight that made her dizzy. Her mouth tasted of dust and bile. She had only a vague idea of where the camp was. Goyal had pointed once toward a hidden canyon in the Dragoon foothills, but she let desperation be her guide. By the time the sun began to dip, painting the rocks in shades of blood and violet, she was stumbling. Coyotes began to yip and howl in the distance, a lonely, chilling sound that signaled the coming of the hunters. She found the camp not by sight, but by the smell of smoke. It was tucked into a narrow fissure in the rocks. Hidden from the casual eye, it was a place of poverty and fear. There were only 4 wickiups, patched with old blankets and hides. A few dogs barked as she approached, gaunt and mean. An old woman stepped out of a shelter, holding a rifle. She lowered it when she saw Maria, a lone woman, unarmed, staggering with exhaustion. "I am looking for Nahas-san," Maria rasped, her throat dry as sandpaper. The old woman gestured with her chin. Nahas-san was sitting by a small fire, grinding corn. When she saw Maria, her eyes widened in shock, and then, almost immediately, filled with shame. She looked different here, thinner, worn down by the elements. But her shoulders were not hunched in terror as they had been at the ranch. "You," Nahas-san said softly. "The maid. Why are you here?" "They took him," Maria said, sinking to her knees beside the fire. She did not have the strength to stand. "The sheriff took Goyala. They say he raided the Johnson place. They say he is a monster." Nahas-san looked down at the cornmeal in her lap. "He did not raid the Johnson place," she said quietly. "I know," Maria said, "but they will hang him for it. Unless you come back. Unless you tell them why you really left. They think he drove you away with violence. They think he killed you." Nahas-san shook her head slowly. "I cannot go back. The white man's town, it is a cage. I cannot breathe there." "He is going to die," Maria cried, "because of a lie." "It is not just a lie," Nahas-san said, her voice heavy with a complicated grief. "It is a tangle. You must understand. Goyale, he is a man standing in a river that flows 2 ways. The white men hate him because he is Apache. But here," she gestured around the meager camp, "some of our own people hate him because he works for the white man. They call him a traitor dog." She looked at Maria, her eyes wet. "The raids. It is not him. It is young men from the mountains. Angry men. They see Goyal working for Mallory, and they hate him for it. They strike near the ranch on purpose. They want the white men to blame him. They want him to suffer for choosing the enemy." Maria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. Goyala was truly alone. He was the scapegoat for the whites and the target for his own kin. He belonged nowhere. "He did not choose them," Maria whispered. "He chose survival. He did it for you." "I know," Nahas-san wept. "That is the tragedy. He became hard to save me, but his hardness terrified me. I looked at him and saw only the war. I saw the death behind his eyes, and I ran." "He loves you," Maria said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. "He loves the memory of what we were," Nahas-san corrected. "But he does not know how to love softly anymore. Not me, perhaps." She looked at Maria, seeing the bleeding scratches on her arms, the fierce determination in her jaw. "Perhaps he can learn again, but not with me." Maria grabbed Nahas-san's hand. "Please, come with me, just to speak to the judge." "No." Nahas-san pulled away gently. "If I go back, they will put me in a reservation camp. Or worse." "I cannot." She reached into a pouch at her waist and pulled out a small object. It was a bracelet woven from horsehair and dyed grass, intricate and strong. "Give him this," Nahas-san said, pressing it into Maria's palm. Tell him I did not run because I hated him. Tell him I ran because I was too weak to carry his pain and mine together. Tell him I release him." Maria closed her fingers around the rough weave of the bracelet. It felt like holding a goodbye. The return journey was a blur of pain, but Maria moved with a new urgency. She had the truth now, even if she didn't have the witness. By the time she reached Silver Creek, the sky had opened up. A sudden, violent downpour lashed the town, turning the dusty streets into a quagmire of thick, sucking mud. It was pitch black, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the false fronts of the buildings like stage sets. Maria was soaked to the bone. Her dress clung to her legs, heavy and cold. She staggered toward the jailhouse, a small stone building at the end of the main street. There was a light in the window of the sheriff's office, but the cell block was around the side. facing a narrow alley. Maria crept through the mud, slipping and catching herself against the rough adobe wall. She found the small, barred window that looked into the cell. "Goyala," she whispered. The rain hammered against the roof, drowning out her voice. She leaned closer, gripping the cold iron bars. "Goyal!" A shadow moved inside. Goyal stepped into the faint light coming from the street lamp. He looked exhausted. His shirt was torn, and there was a bruise on his cheekbone where someone had struck him. He looked up and saw her. For a moment, he stared as if she were an apparition, a spirit conjured by the storm. "Maria," he breathed. He moved to the window. "You should not be here. It is dangerous." "I went to the camp," she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I found her." "I found Nahasan." Goyale froze. His hands gripped the bars, his knuckles white. "She is alive?" "She is alive," Maria said. "She is safe. She told me everything. She told me about the men from the mountains who frame you. She told me—" Maria swallowed past the lump in her throat. "She told me she left because she was afraid. Not of your violence, but of your pain. She said she was too weak to help you carry it." She reached through the bars and pressed the horsehair bracelet into his hand. "She sends this," Maria said. "She says she releases you." Goyal looked down at the bracelet in his hand. The rain dripped from his hair, running down his face like tears he refused to shed. He ran his thumb over the weave. He closed his eyes, and a long, shuddering breath escaped him. It was the sound of a burden being set down, the final severing of a tie that had been strangling him. "She is gone," he whispered. "Truly gone. But I am here," Maria said. Her voice was fierce, cutting through his grief. He opened his eyes and looked at her. He saw her soaked hair plastered to her skull, her shivering shoulders, the mud on her face. He saw that she had walked through hell and back for him. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you risk this? I am a dead man. Maria, go home." "I cannot," she said. "I cannot stand by while they hang you. When they took you, when I saw the rope," she pressed her face against the bars, "my chest ached. It felt like my own life was being taken. I am drawn to you. Goyal, it frightens me, but it is true. I cannot let you die." The confession hung in the air, raw and terrified. Goyal looked at her, and the walls he had built around his heart, the walls of stone and silence, crumbled. He reached through the bars. His hands, large and scarred, cupped her face. The iron pressed into his wrists, biting into the skin. But he ignored it. His palms were warm against her cold, wet cheeks. "Maria," he said, his voice cracking. The name sounded different this time. Not a warning, a prayer. "You owe me nothing. You have risked too much." "I choose to risk it," she whispered. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, savoring the rough warmth of his skin. "I have nothing to give you," he said, the words tearing out of him. "Only danger, only shame." "You give me courage," she said. She turned her face and pressed her lips to his palm, then to his fingers. It was a desperate, reverent kiss. It tasted of rain and iron and salt. It was an act of defiance against the bars that separated them, against the sheriff sleeping in the next room, against the whole world that said a Mexican maid and an Apache scout were dirt under their boots. Goyale made a sound low in his throat, a sound of longing so deep it hurt to hear. He wanted to pull her through the bars. He wanted to wrap her in his arms and shield her from the rain and the hate. But he could only hold her face, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "Go," he whispered. "Please, if they find you here." Footsteps splashed in the mud at the front of the jail. The door creaked open. "I thought I heard something," a deputy's voice grumbled. Maria pulled back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She slipped into the deep shadows of the alley, pressing herself against the wet wall. The deputy walked to the cell door inside. "Quiet in there, Indian. Save your prayers for the morning." Goyale did not answer. He stood by the window, his hand still raised, the ghost of her touch burning on his skin. Maria waited until the light went out, then slipped away into the dark. She was shivering uncontrollably. But inside, a fire had been lit. She was done crying. She was done begging. The next morning broke clear and cold, the air scrubbed clean by the storm. The town was buzzing with the anticipation of the trial. It was a spectacle, a break in the monotony of the hard frontier life. Maria was in the kitchen at the ranch, forcing herself to go through the motions of making coffee. Her mind was racing, plotting, discarding plans. The back door opened and Tom came in, laughing. He was with one of the ranch hands, a man named Miller. "Did you see the look on Barlow's face?" Tom crowed, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "He is ready to string him up right now. He doesn't even want to wait for the judge." "Reckon he did it?" Miller asked. Tom snorted. "Does it matter? Someone did it. Might as well be him. Besides, with him gone, things get easier around here. Pa's too soft." Tom leaned back against the counter, swirling the coffee in his cup. "And once the attention is off the raids, well, let's just say the ledgers in Pa's office are going to look a lot cleaner. If anyone ever found those letters from Sullivan, or the payment records for the scouts we hired, we would all be in hot water. They would ruin more than just the Apaches." He laughed again. "They would show how you clear a valley for grazing without firing a shot yourself. Just pay a few boys to burn a barn, blame the Indians, and watch the price of land drop." Maria froze. She was holding a skillet, and her grip tightened until her knuckles turned white. The room seemed to spin. It wasn't just prejudice. It wasn't just hate. It was business. Hank and the other ranchers were stirring up the raids. They were paying men to simulate Apache attacks to drive out the smaller homesteaders and seize the land cheaply. And they were using Goyal as the perfect scapegoat to cover their tracks. The ledgers, the letters. They were in Hank's office. Maria set the skillet down on the stove with a clatter. Tom looked at her, annoyed. "Watch it. Clumsy," he muttered. "Sorry, Mr. Tom," she mumbled, turning away to hide the look on her face. She knew what she had to do. The realization settled over her with a terrifying clarity. Begging for mercy wouldn't work because they didn't want justice. They wanted a cover-up. The only way to save Goyale was to burn their cover to the ground. She had to steal the evidence. It was madness. If she was caught, she would be jailed. Or worse. Tom would kill her without hesitation if he knew she knew. But as she looked out the window toward the town where the gallows were likely already being built, she touched her cheek where Goyal's hand had rested. "I choose to risk it," she had told him. She waited until nightfall. She waited until the house was quiet. Then, with trembling hands and a heart full of terror, she lit a candle and moved toward the office. She was putting a noose around her own neck, but for the first time in her life, she was holding the rope. The hammering began at dawn. It was a rhythmic, dull thud that echoed off the wooden false fronts of the buildings in Silver Creek, carrying all the way out to the jailhouse and the muddy streets beyond. They were building a gallows. It was a hasty job, constructed from green lumber that still smelled of sap, patched together as if they were fixing a broken corral fence rather than building a place to end a man's life. But in Silver Creek, on this particular Tuesday, craftsmanship did not matter. Only the result mattered. The town was in a fever. The trial, such as it was scheduled for that evening in the back room of the Eagle Saloon, which served as the temporary courthouse when the circuit judge was too drunk or too far away to sit at the real bench. Everyone knew the verdict before the first gavel fell. Goyal was an Apache. He was a stranger, and he was the perfect vessel for all the fear, anger, and grief that had accumulated over years of bloodshed on the frontier. Maria stood in the hallway of the ranch house, listening to the wind rattle the window panes. The house was quiet. Hank Mallory had ridden into town to meet with the sheriff and ensure the proceedings went according to plan. Alice had retired early with a headache, the door to her bedroom firmly shut. Tom was still in town, likely drinking to the prospect of seeing his enemy swing. Maria knew time was running out. She could feel it ticking away in her chest, a frantic beat that matched the hammering she had heard earlier. She looked toward the heavy oak door of Hank's office. It was forbidden territory. In 3 years of working at the Double Bar M, she had never stepped foot inside that room. It was where the business was done, where the money was counted, and where the secrets were kept. She took a breath that shuddered in her lungs, glanced up the stairs to ensure Alice was truly gone, and pushed the office door open. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, old leather, and dust. A single oil lamp burned low on the desk. Left by Hank before he departed, Maria closed the door softly behind her, wincing as the latch clicked. The sound seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silence. She moved to the desk. It was a chaotic mess of papers, maps, and dirty tumblers. She began to sift through them, her hands trembling. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, only that Tom's boast in the kitchen had planted a seed of suspicion that had grown into a terrifying certainty. The ledgers. He had said, "The letters." She opened the top drawer. Nothing but ammunition and a flask. She tried the second. Personal correspondence from a sister in St. Louis. She pulled at the bottom drawer. It was locked. Panic flared hot in her stomach. She looked around the room. On the mantel, beneath a mounted deer head, sat a small ceramic bowl where Hank kept spare keys and coins. She rushed to it, her fingers scrabbling through the contents. She found a small brass key. She ran back to the desk and inserted it. The lock tumbled with a heavy clunk. Maria pulled the drawer open. Inside lay 2 thick leather-bound books and a stack of envelopes tied with twine. She lifted the first book. It was a ledger of cattle sales. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning the columns. It looked normal until she reached the back pages. Here, the handwriting changed. It was hurried. Scrawled. March 3rd, payment to J, D & Company, $50. Services rendered near Box Canyon. April 10th, purchase of Miller Homestead, 12 acres, price $10. Maria froze. The Miller family had vanished in April. Everyone said they had moved on, discouraged by the drought. But $10 for 12 acres? That was theft. She turned the page. May 2nd, 40 Winchester rifles, sold to unidentified party, delivery point Northridge. Northridge was where the raiding party had been spotted before the attack on the Johnson place. Hank Mallory, a man who loudly proclaimed his hatred for the savages, was selling rifles to the very men he claimed to be fighting. Or worse, he was arming hired thugs to play the part. She grabbed the bundle of letters and untied the twine. Her fingers shook so badly she nearly dropped them. She pulled one out. It was addressed to Hank, signed by Sheriff Barlow. Hank. The letter read in a sprawling, arrogant script. The town is getting restless about the stock losses. We need a body. It does not matter who. Just make sure your pet scout is in the wrong place at the wrong time. I will handle the judge. My fee remains the usual 20% of the auction price on the abandoned land. Maria felt bile rise in her throat. It was all there. The raids were not senseless violence. They were a business strategy. They were terrorizing families, driving them off the land, and buying it up for pennies. And Goyale, stoic, silent, convenient Goyale, was the sacrificial lamb they intended to slaughter to keep the town satisfied and blind. Well, the voice came from the doorway. Maria spun around, clutching the papers to her chest. Tom stood there. He was swaying slightly, his face flushed with drink, but his eyes were sharp and cold. He had come back early. I wondered where the little mouse went, Tom said, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him. He looked at the open drawer, then at the papers in her hands. His expression shifted from mockery to a twisted, ugly fury. You have been busy, he said, his voice low, snooping, stealing. It is the truth, Maria whispered, backing away until her hips hit the desk. You are thieves. You and your father. You killed those people. Business, Tom sneered, walking toward her. It is just business. Maria, the West belongs to the strong, the Millers, the Johnsons. They were weak. And you are nothing. He lunged for her. Maria tried to dodge, but the desk trapped her. Tom grabbed her by the hair, yanking her head back. She screamed, the sound tearing from her throat. But he slapped her, hard. The blow sent her sprawling to the floor, the taste of blood filling her mouth. The papers scattered across the rug. "You think you can ruin us?" Tom shouted, standing over her. "You think anyone will listen to a Mexican whore over the biggest rancher in the territory?" He bent down to grab her, his hand reaching for her throat. Maria did not think. She reacted with the instinct of a cornered animal. She brought her knee up, driving it hard into his groin. Tom doubled over, letting out a strangled wheeze of agony. He collapsed to his knees, clutching himself. Maria scrambled up. She grabbed the ledger and the bundle of letters from the floor. She didn't look back. She bolted for the door, threw it open, and ran into the hallway. "Get her!" Tom screamed from the office, his voice high and thin with pain. "Kill her!" Maria burst out the front door and into the night. The wind hit her like a physical blow. The storm that had been threatening all day had finally broken. Rain lashed down in sheets, turning the world into a blur of water and darkness. She ran. She ran toward the road that led to town. Her lungs burned, and her legs felt heavy, but terror gave her speed. Behind her, she heard the sound of the office window smashing, then shouting. A moment later, the thunder of hooves erupted from the barn. They were coming. Maria did not stay on the road. She dove into the brush, tearing her dress on mesquite thorns, sliding down the muddy embankment of the dry wash. She could hear the horses galloping past on the road above, the men shouting to each other. "She can't have got far! Fan out!" She scrambled up the other side, slipping in the mud, and ran through the fields toward the lights of Silver Creek. She didn't run away from the danger. She ran straight into the heart of it. If she was going to die tonight, she would die in the light. She would die screaming the truth. The town was a chaotic scene. Despite the rain, horses were tied to every rail. The windows of the Eagle Saloon glowed yellow, casting long, distorted reflections on the wet street. A crowd had gathered outside, huddled under the overhangs, waiting for the show. Maria staggered onto the main street. She was soaked to the bone, her hair plastered to her skull, her face bruised and swelling from Tom's strike. She looked like a madwoman. She ran toward the saloon. The doors were closed. She hit them with her shoulder, bursting into the room. The noise inside was deafening. Men shouting, glasses clinking, the gavel banging uselessly. The air was thick with smoke. At the front of the room, behind a poker table dragged into service as a bench, sat the judge and Sheriff Barlow. To the side, Hank Mallory stood with his arms crossed. The room fell silent as Maria stumbled in. Every head turned. She stood there, dripping water and blood on the sawdust floor, clutching the leather book and the letters like a shield. "Maria?" Hank stepped forward, his face confusing anger and shock. "What the hell are you doing?" "Lies!" Maria screamed. Her voice cracked, but it carried to the back of the room. "It is all lies!" She ran forward and threw the ledger and the letters onto the poker table in front of the judge. They landed with a heavy slap. "Read it!" she shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Hank. "Read what they did. There were no Apache raids. It was them, Hank Mallory and the sheriff. They paid men to burn the farms. They stole the land." The room erupted. Men jumped to their feet. Hank roared. "She is lying. She is crazy. Get her out of here." Sheriff Barlow lunged for the papers, his face pale. "This is nonsense. Evidence tampering." But a hand shot out and grabbed the sheriff's wrist. It was Old Man Miller's brother, a blacksmith with arms like tree trunks. He snatched a letter from the pile before Barlow could secure it. "Let's see what the girl has brought," the blacksmith growled. He held the letter up to the light. The room went deadly quiet again. "He says here," the blacksmith read, his voice booming, "that the sheriff's cut is 20%. He says to make sure the scout is in the wrong place to take the fall." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a sound of collective realization, the sound of a carefully constructed reality shattering. "And here," another man grabbed the ledger. "My God, my brother's farm. Sold to Mallory for $5. $5! Hank Mallory's face turned the color of ash. "She forged them," he screamed. "She is a whore. She is sleeping with the Apache. She will say anything to save him. I am not lying." "Ah," Maria cried, tears streaming down her face mixed with the rain. "They killed innocent people, and now they want to kill Goyal to hide their sins." Suddenly, the doors behind her crashed open again. Tom Mallory stood there. He was wet, muddy, and his eyes were wild with pain and humiliation. He held a Colt revolver in his hand. "You bitch!" Tom shrieked. He crossed the room in 3 strides. Before anyone could react, he grabbed Maria from behind. He wrapped his arm around her neck, dragging her back against his chest, and pressed the cold barrel of the gun to her temple. "Nobody moves!" Tom yelled. "Nobody touches those papers!" The room froze. The blacksmith dropped the letter. Hank looked at his son, seeing the madness there, and realized the game was over. "Tom," Hank said, his voice trembling, "put the gun down." "No," Tom shouted. "She ruined it. We had it all. We owned this valley, and she ruined it for a savage." Outside, down the street, another drama was unfolding. Goyala stood in his cell, listening to the rain and the distant uproar. He knew something had changed. The air felt different. The door to the cell block opened. It wasn't the sheriff. It was the young deputy, Miller, the nephew of the man who had read the letter. He looked pale, shaken. He held a ring of keys. "They are reading the papers," the deputy whispered. "In the saloon. The girl, she brought the ledgers." Goyale moved to the bars. "Maria?" "She is there," the deputy said. He unlocked the door. The mechanism clicked. "She is telling them everything. Barlow. My uncle says Barlow was in on it." The deputy swung the door open. He looked at Goyal, then at his own badge, pulling it off his shirt and throwing it on the floor. "Go," the deputy said. "Fix this, or we all hang for what we let happen here." Goyal didn't wait. He stormed out of the jail, into the rain. He didn't run like a fugitive. He ran like a warrior. He moved with a terrifying, fluid speed, splashing through the mud toward the saloon. He reached the doors just as Tom was screaming about owning the valley. Goyal kicked the doors open. They slammed against the walls with a crack that sounded like thunder. He stood in the entrance, rainwater dripping from his long hair, his shirt soaked and clinging to his chest. His eyes were burning holes in the smoke-filled air. He looked wild, dangerous, and magnificent. The sight of him, free and enraged, sent a shudder of primal fear through the crowd. Men scrambled back, overturning chairs. Goyal's eyes locked onto Tom. Then they shifted to Maria. He saw the bruise on her face. He saw the gun at her head. He walked forward. He did not rush. He walked with a steady, predator's pace. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea. "Stop!" Tom screamed, pressing the gun harder against Maria's skin. She whimpered, her eyes locked on Goyala. "Take one more step, Indian, and I will blow her brains out." Goyal stopped 10 feet away. He stood motionless, every muscle in his body coiled like a spring. He looked at Tom with a contempt so deep it felt physical. "Let her go," Goyal said. His voice was low, steady, carrying under the sound of the rain pounding on the roof. "She is dead," Tom spat. "You are both dead." "I am the one you want," Goyal said. He spread his arms wide, exposing his chest. "I am the savage. I am the monster. Shoot me. Let the woman go." Maria sobbed. "No, Goyal, no!" "Look at him," Tom laughed, a hysterical, jagged sound. "The noble warrior. You think you are a hero? You are dirt. You are nothing but a dog we let sleep in the barn. My father bought you. We bought your life for a sack of flour and a promise." Tom was drunk on fear and power, the words spilling out of him in a torrent of confession. "We burned those farms," Tom shouted, addressing the room now, past the point of sanity. "And we would do it again, because we are the law here. Not you dirt farmers, not you savages. Us, the Mallorys." He shifted his grip, the gun wavering for a fraction of a second as he gestured. Crack! The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Maria flinched, waiting for the darkness. But the gun at her temple did not fire. Tom jerked. A look of total surprise crossed his face. He looked down at his chest. A red blossom was spreading rapidly across his white shirt. He staggered back, his grip on Maria loosening. She pulled away, falling to her knees. Tom collapsed. He hit the sawdust floor with a heavy thud, twitched once, and lay still. Smoke curled from a rifle at the back of the room. It was the blacksmith holding the weapon. His face was streaked with tears. "That was for my brother," he said, his voice breaking the silence. Then, chaos exploded. "Murder!" Hank screamed, dropping to his knees beside his son. "Arrest him! Arrest them all! Arrest you!" someone shouted back. "You stole our land!" The room dissolved into a brawl. Men were shouting, shoving, throwing punches. The authority of the town had collapsed in an instant. Sheriff Barlow, seeing his empire crumbling, panicked. He drew his revolver. He didn't aim at the blacksmith. He aimed at the easiest target. He aimed at Goyal. "This is your fault!" Barlow screamed. Goyal saw the gun come up. He didn't dodge. He stepped in front of Maria, shielding her with his body, ready to take the bullet to save the woman who had saved him. But before Barlow could pull the trigger, a body slammed into him. It was the young deputy from the jail. He tackled the sheriff, driving him into the bar. The gun went off, sending a bullet harmlessly into the ceiling plaster. "Run!" someone whispered near Goyal's ear. It was one of the townspeople, a man who had read the ledger. Get out of here. They will never forgive you now. Truth or no, run!" Goyal grabbed Maria's hand. He pulled her to her feet. "Come," he said. They ran. They bolted out the back door of the saloon, into the alley. The rain was torrential now. A horse was tied to a rail nearby, a sturdy bay belonging to one of the ranchers. Goyal didn't hesitate. He slashed the reins with his knife and vaulted onto the animal's back. He reached down. Maria grabbed his arm. He swung her up behind him with effortless strength. "Hold on!" he shouted over the storm. He kicked the horse. They thundered down the alley, splashing through deep puddles, and burst out onto the open road. Behind them, they heard more gunshots, shouting, and the bell of the church beginning to toll in a frantic, uneven rhythm. The town was tearing itself apart, consuming itself in a fire of guilt and blame. But they were gone. They rode hard into the night. The wind stung their faces, and the rain soaked them to the skin. But Maria felt none of it. She pressed her face against Goyal's back, her arms wrapped tight around his waist. She could feel the solid, living strength of him, the heat of his body seeping into hers. They were outcasts. They were fugitives. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a stolen horse. But as the lights of Silver Creek faded into the darkness behind them, Maria felt a fierce, overwhelming joy. She had burned every bridge. She had destroyed the life she knew, and she had never felt more free. They rode for hours, putting miles of mud and rock between them and the town. The horse labored, its breath coming in great white plumes. But Goyal pushed it on, guiding them with an instinct that needed no light. Finally, as the sky began to turn the color of bruised iron in the east, signaling the approach of dawn, they slowed. They had reached the foothills of the Dragoons, a landscape of twisted rock and hidden canyons where horses could not easily follow. Goyal guided the exhausted horse into a narrow fissure in the rock wall. It opened up into a small, sheltered box canyon, protected from the wind. He slid off the horse and reached up for her. Maria's legs were numb, her body shaking from cold and the crash of adrenaline. She fell into his arms. He caught her. He didn't set her down. He held her there, her feet dangling inches above the ground, his arms wrapped tight around her waist. They stood in the gray light, shivering, soaked and battered. Goyal looked at her face. He reached up and touched the bruise on her cheek where Tom had hit her. His touch was incredibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence of the night. "You came for me," he whispered. It was not a question. It was a statement of wonder. "I could not let you go," she said, her teeth chattering. "You destroyed them," he said. "For me. For us," she corrected him. In the fragile quiet of the canyon, with no one to watch, no one to judge, the dam finally broke. Goyala pulled her closer. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of rain and skin. A shudder went through his massive frame, a release of years of tension, of holding himself apart, of being the stone that felt nothing. Maria held him, her hands tangling in his wet hair. She felt his heart beating against her chest, a strong, steady rhythm that echoed her own. He lifted his head. His eyes searched hers, dark and intense and full of a raw, terrifying need. "Maria!" he groaned. He kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was hungry. It was desperate. It was the collision of two souls who had been starving for a lifetime. He kissed her with the reverence of a man finding water in the desert, and she kissed him back with a fierce possessiveness. His hands moved over her back, pressing her closer, as if he wanted to merge their bodies into one entity that the world could never separate again. Maria felt seen. She felt chosen. She was not a servant. She was not a nobody. She was the woman who had brought down a town for him. And Goyala, the man of war, the man of scars, felt the ice around his heart shatter. He realized, with a clarity that blinded him, that he could hold something without it breaking. He could hold her. He pulled back just an inch, their foreheads resting together, their breath mingling in the cold air. "We have nothing," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "No home, no people. They will hunt us. Let them hunt," Maria whispered back, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "We are alive, and we are together." It was a refuge. It was a promise. In the dawn light, amidst the red rocks of the unforgiving West, they stood wrapped in each other. Two scarred survivors who had decided that if the world was going to take everything from them, they would build their own world right there, in the space between their bodies. The morning sun did not rise gently in the Dragoon Mountains. It struck the earth like a hammer. There was no soft transition from the gray of dawn to the golden hour, only a sudden, blinding brilliance that bleached the color from the red rocks and promised a heat that would crack the very stones. Maria woke with a gasp, her body stiff and aching from sleeping on the hard ground. The fire they had built the night before was nothing but a circle of cold white ash. Beside her, the space was empty. Panic, sharp and immediate, flared in her chest, the instinct of a woman who had learned that safety was a lie. "I am here," a low voice rumbled from the shadows of a twisted juniper tree. Goyale was standing guard, looking back the way they had come. He was motionless, blending so perfectly with the landscape that she had looked right through him. He turned to her, and his face was grim. "The wind carries no sound of horses," he said, "but they will be coming. Barlow is a man whose pride is worth more to him than water. He will not stop until he sees us dead, or until the land swallows us." Maria sat up, brushing the dirt from her torn dress. Her shoes were ruined, the leather soles worn thin as paper, and her feet throbbed with every movement. She looked at the horizon, a jagged line of peaks that looked less like a sanctuary and more like the teeth of a trap. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice raspy from thirst. "Up," Goyal said, pointing toward the high country where the air was thin and the trails were goat paths. "There are places in the high rocks where the horses of white men break their legs, places where the people still live, hidden like coyotes." They ate a meager breakfast of dried meat and stale water from the canteen, then mounted the stolen bay horse. The animal was tired, its ribs showing through its dusty coat, so they took turns walking to spare its strength. The journey that followed was a descent into a beautiful, brutal purgatory. The land was vast and indifferent to their suffering. They crossed sun-baked plateaus where the heat rose in shimmering waves, distorting the distance until Maria felt she was walking through a fever dream. The earth was cracked and dry, a mosaic of parched clay that crumbled under their feet. They navigated narrow passes where the trail was no wider than a man's hips, with a sheer drop of 300 feet on one side. One misstep meant a fall that would leave nothing to bury. Thorny mesquite and catclaw acacia tore at their clothes and skin, leaving angry red welts that stung with sweat. Maria struggled. Her body, accustomed to the hard labor of the ranch but not the punishing endurance of the trail, began to fail her. Blisters formed on her heels, burst, and formed again. Her lips cracked from the dry air until they bled. The metallic taste of blood, a constant companion. Yet she refused to complain. She watched Goyal walking ahead of the horse, his eyes constantly scanning the ridge lines. His rifle held ready across his chest. He carried the weight of their survival on his shoulders. He carried the guilt of the past and the terror of the future. She would not add the burden of her pain to his load. Whenever he looked back at her, his dark eyes filled with concern. She forced her spine straight and nodded, a silent lie that said, "I am strong enough." 3 days into their flight, the weather turned against them. They were crossing a high, exposed ridge known as the Devil's Spine. To their left, the land fell away into a deep, shadowed canyon. To their right, a steep slope of loose shale. Above them, the sky, which had been a relentless blue for weeks, suddenly bruised purple. Thunderheads built with terrifying speed, piling on top of one another like mountains in the sky. The air turned heavy and static, making the hair on Maria's arms stand up. "Storm!" Goyal shouted over the rising wind. "We must get off the ridge." He grabbed the horse's bridle and began to pull it forward, moving faster. Maria, riding, gripped the mane, her knuckles white. The rain did not start as a drizzle. It began as a deluge, a wall of water that slammed into them with the force of a physical blow. In seconds, the dust of the trail turned to slick, treacherous grease. Lightning split the sky, a blinding fork of white fire that struck a rock formation 100 yards ahead. The thunderclap following so closely it shook the ground. The horse panicked. It reared, its hooves scrabbling for purchase on the wet stone. "Steady!" Goyal roared, fighting the animal's weight. But the ground gave way. The edge of the trail crumbled. The horse's hind legs slipped over the precipice. Maria screamed as the world tilted. The horse went down, sliding toward the abyss. She threw herself from the saddle, hitting the mud hard. She rolled, clawing at the wet earth. But the momentum was too great. She slid toward the edge, her fingers scraping uselessly against the slick rock. Her legs went over. She felt the sickening drop in her stomach as gravity took hold. "Maria!" A hand clamped around her wrist. It was a grip of iron. Goyal had lunged, throwing himself flat on the mud, anchoring his body against a boulder. He caught her just as she went over. Maria dangled above the drop, the rain lashing her face, her feet kicking at empty air. Far below, she could see the jagged tops of pine trees through the mist. She looked up. Goyal's face was contorted with effort and terror. His teeth were bared, the veins in his neck bulging as he held her dead weight against the slick mud and the rain. He looked into her eyes, and in that moment, she saw the depth of his fear, not for himself, but the absolute, crushing horror of losing her. "Hold on!" he roared, a sound that tore from his chest. He hauled her up. He pulled with a strength born of desperation, dragging her over the lip of the cliff and onto the muddy trail. He didn't stop until he had pulled her 5 feet back from the edge. He collapsed on top of her, breathing in ragged, heaving gasps. He buried his face in her wet hair, his arms crushing her against him. He was shaking. The great stoic warrior was shaking uncontrollably. "I have you," he whispered into the mud. "I have you." They lay there in the rain until the worst of the storm passed. 2 small, fragile things clinging to the earth and to each other. The horse, miraculously, had scrambled to safety on its own further up the trail. They found shelter in a shallow cave as evening fell. It was little more than an overhang of rock, dry and out of the wind. Goyal built a small fire from dry wood he found in the recesses of the cave. As the warmth returned to her limbs, Maria broke down. It wasn't the fall. It wasn't the pain in her feet. It was the weight of it all crashing down on her. She curled into a ball, sobbing, her body racking with heaves that she couldn't stop. She was crying for the girl she used to be, the maid with a warm bed and a predictable life. She was crying for the terrified woman dangling over a cliff. She was crying because she realized, with terrifying clarity, that she had chosen a life where death would always be a heartbeat away. Goyal moved to her. He did not speak. He sat behind her and pulled her back against his chest, wrapping his large arms around her. He held her while she wept, his chin resting on the top of her head. His hands, usually so busy with weapons or work, were surprisingly gentle. He stroked her wet, tangled hair, a rhythmic, soothing motion. "I am sorry," he whispered. His voice was rough with guilt. "I have brought you to a hard place. I have brought you to the edge of the world." Maria turned in his arms, burying her face in his damp shirt. "I was so afraid," she choked out. "When I slipped, I thought I was gone." "I would not let you go," he said. "I would have gone over with you first." He lifted her chin so she had to look at him. The firelight danced in his dark eyes, illuminating the scar on his jaw and the new lines of worry etched around his mouth. "I have lived a long time with death," Goyal said quietly. "I have walked with it. I have slept with it. I thought I was not afraid of it anymore. But today, when I saw you fall, I felt a fear I have never known." He paused, his thumb tracing the line of her tear-stained cheek. "I would rather die beside you, fighting the whole world," he said, the words heavy and solemn, "than live another day alone among people who treat me like a beast. You make me human. Maria, you make me want to live." Maria looked at him, her heart aching. The fear began to recede, replaced by a fierce, burning warmth. She realized that safety was not a roof or a job. Safety was this man. "I am not leaving," she whispered fiercely, clinging to his shirt. "Despite the danger, despite the hunger, I have never felt more alive than I do right now. I know who I want to stand beside." She pressed her hand over his heart. "My desire is not just a feeling, Goyal, it is a vow. Where you go, I go. If we fall together." In the flickering light of the cave, the bond between them hardened into something unbreakable. It was no longer just a flight from the law. It was a pilgrimage toward a life they were carving out of nothing. As the days turned into weeks, the terror of the chase began to fade into the rhythm of survival. They traveled deeper into the mountains, moving slowly to pass the long hours on the trail. They began to talk of the future. They did not speak of grand things, of riches or pardons. They spoke of small, practical dreams. "A place by water," Maria said one afternoon as they rested in the shade of a pine tree. "Not a well I have to draw from. A running creek, clean and cold. And trees," Goyal added, whittling a piece of cedar. "Cover, so a man can sit by his fire and not have to look over his shoulder every time a twig snaps." "I want a garden," she mused. "Corn, squash, and herbs, the kind my mother used to grow. Sage and mint. I will build a fence for this garden," he promised. "Tight enough to keep the deer out." It was a fantasy, perhaps, but it kept them putting one foot in front of the other. Eventually, they found what Goyal was looking for. It was a rugged valley, hidden behind a labyrinth of canyons that would confuse any tracker not born to the land. Smoke rose in thin wisps from the valley floor. "Here," Goyal said, pulling the horse up. "The band of Red Sleeve. They are tired of war. They hide here." Their arrival was not met with open arms. As they rode down the scree slope, figures emerged from the brush, men with rifles, their faces painted with caution and distrust. Goyal held his hands up. Palms open, he spoke in his own tongue, his voice carrying across the distance. The mood was tense. These were people who had been hunted like wolves for a generation. They were thin, their clothes patched, their eyes hard. Some of the older warriors remembered Goyal as a fearsome fighter, a man of honor. But others, the younger ones with bitterness in their mouths, saw only the man who had worn the white man's clothes and worked for the rancher who stole their land. And Maria. The sight of a Mexican woman, a Nakai sitting behind him, clinging to his waist, deepened the scowls. To them, she was the enemy. They were led to the center of the camp. A council was called. The leader, a scarred old man named Red Sleeve. sat on a buffalo robe. He looked at Goyale with eyes like flint. "You bring the white man's law behind you," Red Sleeve said. "You bring trouble." Goyale stood tall, Maria at his side. He spoke for a long time. He told them of the ranch. He told them of the ledgers and the lies. He told them of the hanging rope and the escape. Then he pointed to Maria. "This woman," he said, his voice ringing with pride, "is not of our blood, but she has the heart of a warrior. She walked into the white man's court and threw their lies in their faces. She saved me when my own people turned away. She is with me. She is my wife in the eyes of the spirits, if not the law." Voices rose in dissent. "She is a danger," one man shouted. "Send them away." "Trouble follows them like vultures follow a dying buffalo. We have cast out enough of our own," another argued. "The world is small enough for us. Shall we make it smaller?" The argument raged until a figure stepped out from the crowd of women. It was Nahastzan. She looked different than she had at the ranch. She wore traditional buckskin, and her hair was loose. She looked weary, but the terror that had defined her was gone. The camp fell silent. Nahazan walked to the center of the circle. She looked at Goyala, and her eyes were full of a deep, ancient sorrow, but no hatred. "I know this man," she said to the council. Her voice was soft but clear. "I was his wife. I fled from him." She turned to Maria. A flicker of recognition passed between them, the bond of the secret meeting in the night. "I fled," Nahastzan continued, addressing the tribe, "because I was afraid. Not that he would hurt me, but that the world had broken him into something hard and sharp, and I was too soft to hold him. I feared the white man's world would crush us both." She looked back at Goyala. "He is not a traitor. He did what he had to do to keep breath in his body. He is a survivor, and he does not kill those under his protection." She stepped forward and took Maria's hand. Then Goyala's. She placed Maria's hand in his. "I release him," she said. "Build what you can. The spirits know we need new life here, no matter the blood." It was a blessing. It was permission. Reluctantly, the mood shifted. Red Sleeve nodded. "You may stay, but you stay on the edge, up the valley. If soldiers come, you are the first to know." It was a compromise born of exhaustion, but it was enough. Months passed. They were hard months, filled with the simple, brutal labor of living. They built a rough shelter against a rock wall, using fallen timber and hides. It was not the cabin of their dreams, but it was warm. The wild land remained harsh. Winter brought snow that drifted 3 feet deep, but it was a shared harshness. Maria learned the ways of the mountains. She learned to grind mesquite beans into flour, to read the clouds for the thread of snow, to weave baskets from yucca fibers. Her hands, once red from lye soap, became calloused and brown, strong enough to skin a rabbit or haul firewood. And Goyal changed. The stone man began to crack, revealing the flesh beneath. He learned to soften his voice when he spoke to her. He learned to explain the way of the woods instead of simply expecting her to know. Their love deepened in the quiet moments. It was found in the way he would drape his heavy buffalo robe over her shoulders when the fire burned low. It was in the way she would tease him about his snoring, making him laugh, a rusty, unfamiliar sound that seemed to surprise even him. It was in the way his hand would instinctively find hers in the dark when a wolf howled or a distant gunshot echoed on the wind. One evening in early spring, when the snow was melting into the creek, Maria sat by the fire, mending a pair of moccasins. She stopped, her needle hovering over the leather. She counted the days in her head. Then she counted them again. She looked up at Goyala, who was cleaning his rifle. "Goyal," she said. He looked up, sensing the shift in her tone. "What is it? Is it the soldiers?" "No," she said. She put the moccasins down. "My cycle. It has not come. Not for 2 moons. The silence that filled the shelter was sudden and absolute." Goyal froze. He looked at her stomach, flat beneath her tunic, and then at her face. The realization hit them both with the force of a physical blow. A child. Fear washed over Goyal's face, a stark, naked terror. He looked at the rough walls of their shelter, at the rifle in his hands, at the unforgiving world outside. "A child," he whispered. Here, in this place? Maria, how can we bring a life into this? They will hunt him. They will starve him. He was thinking of his niece, of the fire, of the loss that never healed. Maria stood up and went to him. She took the rifle from his hands and set it aside. She took his face in her hands. "Yes," she said. "Here, in this place." She felt the fear, too, the terrifying vulnerability of being a mother in a war zone. But beneath the fear, a fierce, white-hot determination ignited in her blood. "They tried to kill us," she whispered. "They tried to erase us. They tried to say that people like you and people like me should not exist. But we are here." She pressed his hand against her belly. "This," she said, her voice shaking with emotion, "is our answer. To create a life that carries both our blood, that is the greatest defiance. Goyal. We will not just survive, we will grow." Goyale looked at her, and tears welled in his eyes, spilling over to track through the dust on his cheeks. He fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around her waist, pressing his face against her stomach. He held on as if she were the only solid thing in the universe. A strange, cautious hope began to bloom in his chest, fragile as a desert flower. The final scene found them sitting outside their shelter on a clear, cold night. The sky was a deep, velvet blue, pierced by a million stars that looked close enough to touch. The mountains loomed around them like silent, ancient guardians. The fire popped and crackled, sending sparks drifting up toward the Milky Way. They were wrapped together in a large wool blanket, shielding each other from the wind. Goyala was behind Maria, his legs bracketing hers. He was doing something he had not done since before the wars began. He was braiding her hair. His large, scarred hands moved with surprising care, weaving the dark strands together. He worked slowly, deliberately. Each twist of the hair felt like a prayer. Each crossover was a promise woven into the fiber of their lives. "I will stay. I will protect. I will love." Maria leaned back against his broad chest, her eyes half closed, listening to the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her spine. One of her hands rested protectively on her belly. "We will teach him to ride before he can walk," Goyal murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest. "And I will teach him to read," Maria added softly, "so he knows the lies when he sees them." "He will belong to the mountains," Goyal said. "He will belong to us," Maria corrected. They fell silent, watching the stars wheel overhead. They were two fugitives, scarred by tragedy, hunted by the law, surrounded by a world that wanted them dead. They had no money. They had no title to the land. But as Goyale tied the end of the braid and wrapped his arms around her, pulling her and their unborn child tight against him, they knew they had won. They had chosen love in a time of hate. They had chosen each other in a world that preached separation. And in the vast, quiet darkness of the West, that small act of defiance burned brighter than any fire. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and shadows of the old frontier, and I hope the tale of Goyal and Maria has touched something in your spirit. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and share your location. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. There are many more tales of the frontier waiting to be told. Stories of grit, survival, and the kind of love that endures against all odds. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. Did their ending feel like a victory to you? I look forward to reading your words.